Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Netheric Horror. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. A few years ago, when I was around 23 years old, I had an experience that completely changed the way I view intuition. It wasn't supernatural, and nothing dramatic ended up happening, but it taught me a lesson that I've carried with me ever since. Sometimes your instincts notice things before your conscious mind does. At the time, I was working with a guy who seemed pretty nice. We got along well enough, and I thought he was kind of cute. Nothing serious had happened between us, but I enjoyed talking to him at work, and I got the impression that he liked me too. The situation became slightly complicated because one of my friends also had a crush on him. Not just a small crush, either. She really liked him. At the time, I wasn't actively pursuing anything romantic, so it wasn't something I spent much time thinking about. He was attractive, sure, but I wasn't emotionally invested. One evening after work, he came over to my place to hang out. Everything felt completely normal. We talked, joked around, and spent a few hours together. There were no major red flags. Nothing happened that immediately made me uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like a typical evening between coworkers who were getting to know each other better. As the night was winding down and he was getting ready to leave, he asked me if I wanted to go to a movie with him that Friday. I was a little surprised, but I agreed. At the time, it seemed harmless. He smiled, seemed happy about it, and eventually headed home. After he left, I messaged my friend and told her what had happened. The moment I mentioned the movie invitation, her reaction wasn't what I expected. She became upset. Not angry exactly, but clearly hurt. She reminded me how much she liked him and asked if I would reconsider going. I remember feeling guilty. She had talked about him for a long time, and I knew her feelings were genuine. After thinking about it for a while, I decided that preserving the friendship mattered more to me than a movie date with someone I wasn't seriously interested in. So I contacted him and told him I had changed my mind. I tried to be polite about it. I explained that I didn't think it was a good idea and that I wanted to cancel. I expected him to be disappointed. What I didn't expect was how persistent he became. At first, he kept asking why. Then he tried convincing me to reconsider. He kept pushing for an explanation. The conversation started making me uncomfortable. Nothing he said was openly threatening, but there was a strange intensity to it. The more I tried to politely decline, the harder he pushed. Eventually, though, he seemed to accept it. The conversation ended. Everything appeared resolved. Yet something felt wrong. Even now, years later, I can remember the feeling clearly. It wasn't a logical thought. It wasn't based on evidence. It was just a sudden, overwhelming urge. Lock your doors, lock your windows. I couldn't explain it. Nothing had happened that should have made me feel unsafe, at least not consciously. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. So I listened. I checked every door. I checked every window. I made sure everything was locked. At the time, I even felt slightly ridiculous doing it. Part of me wondered if I was being paranoid. After all, this was someone I knew, someone I worked with. Someone who had simply been disappointed after being turned down. But despite feeling silly, I locked everything anyway. Then I settled in for the night. Hours passed. The apartment was quiet. Eventually, I went to bed. At some point after midnight, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it. Tap, 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 a soft sound coming from my window. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. Then it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. My heart immediately started racing. Slowly, I sat up and looked toward the window. The moment I realized someone was outside, fear washed over me. Standing outside my apartment was the same coworker, the guy who had asked me to the movies, the guy I had turned down, the guy who was supposed to be at home. Instead, he was standing outside my window at 1 o'clock in the morning, trying to get my attention. For a few seconds, I couldn't process what I was seeing. My mind kept searching for a reasonable explanation. Maybe there was some emergency. Maybe something terrible had happened. Maybe there was a legitimate reason he was there. But as soon as he started trying to talk to me through the window, those possibilities disappeared. He wasn't there because of an emergency. He wasn't there because he needed help. He was there because he wanted to continue discussing the movie date. At 1 in the morning, outside my apartment. The fear I felt in that moment is difficult to describe. Until then, I had mostly questioned my instincts. Now, they suddenly made perfect sense. Something deep inside me had recognized the problem long before I consciously did. That's why I had felt compelled to lock everything. That's why I had felt uneasy after the conversation. That's why I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I was living alone at the time. That realization made the situation even more frightening. There was nobody else in the apartment. Nobody to help if things escalated. Nobody to call out to. Just me. And someone standing outside my window in the middle of the night. I grabbed my phone and started messaging friends. Fortunately, a few people were still awake. I explained what was happening. Their reactions were immediate. Every single one of them told me the same thing. Call the police. Looking back, they were absolutely right. At the time, though, I hesitated. I was worried about drawing attention to myself. I was renting and didn't want to create problems. I also had this irrational image in my head of police cars arriving with flashing lights and blaring sirens. I didn't realize then that police can respond quietly when necessary. So instead of calling, I stayed inside and continued messaging friends. Meanwhile, he remained outside. The minutes crawled by. Every sound made me jump. Every movement outside the window increased my anxiety. I kept hoping he would leave. I kept hoping he would realize how inappropriate the situation was and go home. Instead, he lingered. Minutes turned into nearly an hour. An entire hour of sitting inside my apartment feeling trapped. An entire hour of wondering whether he would leave. An entire hour of questioning whether I should finally call the police. Eventually, he did leave. I remember feeling an enormous sense of relief. But relief wasn't the only emotion. There was also anger, because the more I thought about it, the more unacceptable his behavior seemed. Showing up uninvited at someone's home during the middle of the night isn't romantic. It isn't persistent. It isn't sweet. It's alarming. The next morning, I went to work. I barely slept. The entire night kept replaying in my head. As soon as I arrived, I reported what had happened. I explained everything. The date invitation, the cancellation, the pressure afterward, the late night visit, the window tapping, all of it. The company took the situation seriously. As far as I know, he was eventually fired. Though from what I heard later, it wasn't solely because of what happened with me. Apparently, there were other issues as well. Learning that only reinforced my belief that my instincts had been warning me about something I couldn't yet see. For a long time afterward, I thought about that night. I thought about how easily I could have ignored the feeling to lock my doors and windows. I thought about how strange it was that the urge had appeared before anything actually happened. Most of all, I thought about how often people dismiss their intuition because they don't have enough evidence to justify it. The truth is, instincts aren't always magical warnings. Sometimes they're simply your brain recognizing subtle details that your conscious mind hasn't processed yet. A tone of voice, a reaction, a look, a feeling that something doesn't quite add up. Whatever the reason, I'm grateful I listened. Nothing terrible happened. I stayed safe. And I learned a lesson that has stuck with me ever since. When something feels wrong, pay attention. You don't have to panic. You don't have to assume the worst. But you should never ignore that quiet voice inside you when it tells you to be careful. Because sometimes your instincts notice danger long before you understand why. And sometimes listening to your gut can make all the difference. This happened just a few nights ago, and I still don't fully know how to process it. It could have been nothing more than a series of coincidences stacked together at the worst possible time, but it didn't feel like that in the moment. My boyfriend and I had planned to go fishing late at night after I got off my shift at Taco Bell. I was already tired before we even started, but we both agreed earlier in the day that we wanted to go out that late, so I tried to push through it. When I finished work, he convinced me to go anyway. We found a new spot the night before and decided to go back there. It was near a boat launch right by a river. The area was dark, quiet, and mostly empty, except for the occasional passing car. The atmosphere already felt a little off just because of how isolated it was, but nothing seemed unusual at first. We fished there for maybe 20 minutes before realizing how dark it really was. We could barely see our lines, barely see the water, and everything felt more like guessing than actually fishing. So we drove to a mire before it closed at midnight and grabbed a headlamp. After that, we went back to the same area. This time, we stayed longer. We moved around between docks near the boat launch, trying different spots, just talking and passing time. It was around an hour into fishing when we noticed police lights across the river at another boat launch. At first, we didn't think much of it. Probably a routine check. Maybe someone being questioned for being out too late. It didn't seem connected to us at all, so we stayed where we were. 15 minutes or so after the police left that area, we heard something that immediately made us stop. A shout. At first, it was unclear, but then it became more distinct. It sounded like someone yelling something aggressive, almost like "fuck everyone." We both looked at each other, unsure if we had heard it correctly. It was dark enough that sound carried strangely over the water, so we assumed it was maybe just teenagers messing around somewhere nearby. But then it happened again later, and again after that. This time, it wasn't just shouting. It sounded like someone calling for help, not once, but repeatedly, always coming from the same general direction near where the police had been earlier. At that point, the mood completely shifted. We weren't fishing anymore. We were listening, trying to understand what we were hearing, trying to decide if it was real or just our imagination playing tricks in the dark. After about 2 hours of this on and off, we decided to leave. My boyfriend had to work early in the morning, and we were both exhausted. But before heading home, we made the decision to drive over and check the area where the sounds were coming from. It wasn't the smartest choice, but at the time it felt like the responsible one. If someone was actually in trouble, ignoring it didn't feel right. We drove across a toll bridge that separated the two boat launches and took a narrow back road toward the area. The road was almost completely unlit. The only source of visibility was the truck headlights cutting through the darkness. Tall grass lined both sides of the road, and beyond that, it was just blackness. Everything felt extremely quiet in a way that made the earlier sounds even more unsettling. As we got closer to the water, I noticed something in the road ahead. At first, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. Then, I realized it was a person, a woman, standing in the middle of the road. My boyfriend hadn't seen her yet, so I immediately panicked and tried to get his attention. By the time he slowed down and we approached her, there was no avoiding it. She was just there, in the middle of an empty road at around 2 in the morning. As we got closer, I could see her more clearly. She looked older, maybe around 60 or 70 years old. Her hair was gray and thin, falling to her shoulders in uneven strands. Her posture was hunched forward, as if her body had been shaped by years of pain or strain. Her face looked wrong in a way that's hard to explain clearly. Not physically distorted in an impossible way, but unsettling in how it appeared under the headlights. Her mouth was slightly open, her expression blank but confused, like she didn't fully understand where she was. For a moment, my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was lost. Maybe she had dementia. Maybe she was confused or in distress. That was the most logical explanation I could think of. But as we passed her, something happened that completely changed the feeling of the situation. As our truck rolled by with the driver's window partially down, she suddenly reacted. Her entire upper body lunged toward the vehicle. It wasn't a stumble or a step forward. It was a sudden, forceful movement, like she was trying to reach us or grab onto the truck as we passed. Her eyes widened dramatically in that instant. Not just widened, but opened in a way that looked almost unnatural under the headlights. Her jaw shifted slightly as well, hanging open a bit more than before, and for a split second, her entire expression changed from confusion to something far more intense. Fear or aggression, or something I still can't properly define. It all happened in seconds. My boyfriend kept driving, and as soon as we were past her, I was already panicking, telling him we needed to turn around and get out of there. We circled back quickly, but we didn't see her again. We didn't stay to investigate further. We drove away and stopped several blocks down the road just to make sure nothing was following us. And then I called emergency services. The call itself felt longer than it should have. I was trying to explain what we saw while also trying to stay calm enough to be understood. The dispatcher asked a lot of questions, but I could tell it wasn't coming across clearly, especially with how shaken I was. Eventually, police were sent out to check the area. When we spoke to the officers later, they told us they had already been there earlier that night because of similar reports. That made everything feel even stranger. We went home after that, still unsettled, and ended up listening to the police scanner for a while just to see if anything came up. A bit later, we heard that officers didn't find anything in the area. They suggested it might have been animals or environmental noise. Coyotes were mentioned, which made some sense since they are common in parts of Michigan. But what we heard earlier didn't sound like coyotes. It sounded too clear, too human, too intentional. Then, just as we were finally arriving home and parking, I noticed something else that made the night feel even more surreal. Across the street from our house, partially hidden behind a tree, was a large yellow dog. It didn't bark or run. It just stood there, watching us. At first, I assumed it was just someone's pet that had gotten out. That seemed like the simplest explanation. But as we got out of the truck and walked toward the house, the dog stayed still. It didn't follow. It didn't leave. It just stood there in the road, staring in our direction. Eventually, we went inside and locked the door, still trying to process everything that had happened. Even now, I keep going back over it in my head. The screaming, the abandoned road, the woman standing in the middle of nowhere, the way she moved toward the truck, the police finding nothing, the dog at the end of the night. Individually, each part might have an explanation, but together, it doesn't feel like something that should have happened all in the same night. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was misunderstanding in the dark. Maybe it was just a series of unrelated events that happened to line up perfectly. Or maybe it was exactly what it looked like in the moment. A night where nothing made sense until it was finally over. I've always been a pretty paranoid person. Even when nothing is happening, my brain tends to assume something bad is right around the corner. I know that about myself, and most of the time I can rationalize it. I can tell myself I'm overthinking things, that I'm safe, that nothing is wrong. But there was one period in my life where that fear didn't feel like paranoia anymore. It felt justified. It was winter, maybe January, when this happened. I was still a teenager. It was cold, dark early, and my neighborhood was quiet in that way suburban streets get when most people are already inside for the night. Streetlights were spaced far apart, and there wasn't much movement outside unless you were really looking for it. That night, I was about 50 meters down the street from my house, standing near the road, waiting for a friend. It was around 10 in the evening, maybe a bit later. I remember checking my phone over and over, waiting for a message or a call saying they were close. Nothing felt unusual at first. Just a cold night. Just waiting. Then I noticed someone walking down the street. A man. He was wearing a long, dark jacket. He had black hair and a beard, probably in his 30s. I didn't recognize him at all. That alone made me uneasy because I usually knew most of the people in my neighborhood, at least by sight. Something about him immediately made me feel alert. Not because he was doing anything aggressive. He wasn't. He was just walking. But my instincts reacted before I even had time to think. As he got closer, I tried to act normal. I looked at my phone again, pretending I wasn't paying attention. But I could feel him approaching in my peripheral vision. Then he reached the point where I was standing. We made eye contact. And he didn't look away. He looked directly at me. Not a quick glance. Not a passing look. A sustained stare. While still walking. For about 15 seconds. It felt longer than it should have. Much longer. There was something about his expression I still can't explain properly. It wasn't anger. It wasn't friendliness. It wasn't curiosity either. It felt blank in a way that didn't sit right with me, like there was no emotion behind it at all, just attention. Focused attention. The kind that makes your body tense before your brain even understands why. I remember feeling my stomach drop slightly as he passed me. I stayed where I was for a moment, trying to convince myself I was being ridiculous. People look at each other. That's normal. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he was distracted. Maybe I was overreacting, like I often do. So I moved and sat on a bench just outside my house, trying to calm myself down. I checked my phone again. A couple of minutes passed. Then I looked down the street. And that's when I saw him again. He was standing at the end of the street, not walking anymore, just standing there, facing in my direction. Watching, the moment I saw that, something in me shifted from discomfort to full panic. Because standing still like that didn't feel accidental. It felt intentional. I didn't wait to analyze it further. I got up immediately and went inside my house. I didn't tell anyone that night. I told myself I was just being paranoid again, that there was probably a reasonable explanation. Maybe he lived nearby. Maybe he was waiting for someone else. Maybe I was reading too much into a coincidence. I tried to forget about it. But the next day made that much harder. In the morning, I went shopping with a friend in a different area, far from my neighborhood. It was daytime, everything felt normal, and I wasn't thinking about the night before anymore. The fear had mostly faded, replaced by that familiar feeling of it was probably nothing. After we finished, I started walking back home alone. At first, everything seemed fine. Normal streets, normal traffic, normal people, nothing unusual. But after about 10 minutes, I noticed something behind me. Footsteps. At first, I didn't pay attention. People walk behind you all the time. But these footsteps didn't feel random. They stayed consistent. Same pace as mine, same distance behind me. I didn't look back immediately. I told myself I was imagining it, but the longer I walked, the more certain I became that someone was following me. The footsteps didn't change speed. They didn't drift away. They stayed right behind me. After about 20 minutes, I finally forced myself to look back, and I saw him. The same man, the same jacket, the same face, the same eyes. The moment I saw him, my entire body reacted instantly. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. It didn't feel like coincidence anymore. It felt like something that had been continuing from the night before. I didn't stop to think. I called my brother immediately and asked him what I should do. He told me to go into a store, anywhere public, and stay there. The closest shop was still a good 15 minutes away, but it felt much longer. Every step felt heavier. Every second felt stretched. I kept checking behind me without fully turning around. He was still there, still following. When I finally reached the store, I went inside quickly, trying to act like everything was normal even though I was shaking. But then something happened that made everything worse. He came inside too. The moment I saw him walk through the door, it felt like the air left the room. He looked at me again. That same expression, that same stare. And at that point, I broke down. I started crying and told the cashier I needed help. A woman working nearby noticed and immediately came over. She took me to a small business area inside or connected to the store so I could calm down and sit somewhere safe. I called my mom after that and told her everything. She came to pick me up as soon as she could. Even after I got home, I couldn't fully relax. Every time I went outside after that, I kept scanning for him, looking over my shoulder, checking streets I passed, trying to convince myself it was over. For a few days, I didn't see him. Then, a couple of days later, I saw him near my school, just standing there, not approaching, not doing anything obvious, just there. After that, he started appearing more often in my neighborhood. Not constantly, but often enough that I couldn't ignore it. Always at a distance, always watching. Eventually, after a month or two, it stopped. Completely, no more sightings. No more following, no explanation. Just gone. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted. I've tried to rationalize it in every way I can think of. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe I saw different people and my mind connected them. Maybe fear made me link separate events into one story. That's always possible. But what I remember most clearly isn't just the sightings themselves. It's the feeling. That consistent, quiet certainty that I was being watched long before I ever turned around. And the look in his eyes that I still can't quite explain. Whatever it was, it's something I've never forgotten. I rewrote it according to your rules, simple English, smooth flow, no headings, no bold characters, and kept close to the original story, while making it more engaging for a USA, UK, Canada audience. This is one of the creepiest true stories I have ever come across, and even years after first reading about it, it still makes my skin crawl. The story began with an elderly man living alone in his home in Denver. His wife had recently been admitted to the hospital after suffering a broken hip, so for the first time in many years, he found himself by himself in the house. He wasn't completely alone, though. The neighbors nearby knew about his situation and felt sorry for him. Every evening, they invited him over for dinner so he could have a warm meal and some company. They would often send him home with leftovers for lunch the next day. It became part of his routine. Every evening, he would walk over, spend some time talking with the neighbors, eat dinner, and return home. Everything seemed normal. Then, one evening, he never showed up. At first, the neighbors assumed he simply wasn't feeling well or had decided to stay home, but as the hours passed, they became concerned. This wasn't like him. He was a creature of habit, and he never missed dinner without letting someone know. One of the neighbors eventually decided to check on him. When he arrived at the house, everything appeared normal from the outside. The lights were off. The doors were locked. There were no signs of forced entry or anything suspicious. But once inside, he made a horrifying discovery. The elderly man had been brutally beaten to death in his own kitchen. Police arrived quickly and began investigating. The crime scene made very little sense. Every door was locked. Every window was secure. There were no signs of a break-in. No obvious suspect. No clear motive. It was as if the killer had appeared out of nowhere and vanished the same way. Investigators searched the property carefully. They examined the rooms, checked the windows, inspected the basement, and looked for anything that might explain how someone had entered or left the home. But they found nothing. The case quickly became one of those mysteries that frustrated everyone involved. A man had been murdered inside his own home, yet there seemed to be no way for the killer to have gotten in or out. Eventually, with no leads to follow, the investigation slowed. Meanwhile, the victim's wife recovered enough to leave the hospital and return home. Understandably, she was shaken by what had happened. The house that had once felt safe now felt different. Because she was still recovering from her injury, she hired a friend to stay with her and help around the house. Not long after moving back in, both women began noticing strange things. At first, it seemed minor. Food would disappear from the kitchen. Small items would be moved. Sometimes they would hear strange noises coming from other parts of the house. They would hear creaking sounds when nobody was walking around. Sometimes they would hear faint movements overhead. Neither of them could explain it. The friend tried to dismiss it at first. Old houses make noise. People misplace things. Stress can make you imagine things. But the incidents kept happening. The missing food became more frequent. The strange sounds became harder to ignore. Soon, the friend became convinced something wasn't right. Eventually, she told the widow she couldn't stay there anymore. She believed the house was haunted. As strange as it sounds now, that explanation seemed more reasonable to her than what was actually happening. The friend moved out. The widow stayed a little longer, but eventually left as well. She moved in with her son so she could continue recovering somewhere she felt safer. The house sat empty. Months passed. The abandoned property began attracting attention from neighbors. People reported seeing lights turn on and off at odd hours. Some claimed they heard movement inside. Others complained about strange smells coming from the house. Several neighbors called the police. Officers would come out, check the property, find nothing unusual, and leave again. Most assumed local kids were sneaking inside and playing pranks. It seemed like the most reasonable explanation. Then one night, everything changed. A neighbor noticed movement through one of the windows. This time, it wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a strange light. It was clearly a person. Police were called immediately. Officers arrived and entered the house expecting to catch a trespasser. They searched every room. Nothing, they checked the basement. Nothing, they checked the kitchen. Nothing, once again it appeared that whoever had been seen inside had somehow vanished. But then one of the officers heard a sound, a faint noise. It seemed to come from a closet. The officers approached carefully. At first, the closet appeared normal. Then, they noticed something unusual. There was a hidden opening leading upward. Suddenly, they heard movement above them. The officers rushed forward and pulled the closet open wider. For just a moment, they caught sight of a pair of legs disappearing into the darkness above. Someone was hiding in the attic. The officers climbed up after him and finally discovered the truth. The killer had been living inside the house the entire time. Not for days, not for weeks, for months. The hidden space in the attic had originally been overlooked during the murder investigation because investigators believed the opening was too small for a person to fit through. They were wrong. The man had squeezed through the opening and created a secret hiding place above the house. He had been sleeping there, living there, watching the occupants below, stealing food whenever he believed it was safe, listening to conversations, moving through the house while people slept. The discovery shocked everyone. The attic space was filthy. Investigators described it as almost unbearable. The man had created a crude nest like shelter hidden in the darkness. Because he rarely left the attic, the conditions inside had become disgusting. Some reports claimed the smell was so overwhelming that officers became physically sick while examining the area. The man himself became known as the Denver Spider-Man because of his ability to move through tiny spaces and remain hidden above people for long periods of time. But the most disturbing part wasn't the hiding place. It was his confession. According to reports, he explained that he had originally entered the home simply looking for food and shelter. He was homeless and in poor health. Winter was approaching, and he didn't think he could survive another season on the streets. One day, he found the house unlocked and entered. While exploring, he discovered the hidden attic space. He climbed inside and realized nobody could easily find him there. So he stayed. At first, he only came down when the homeowner wasn't around. He would quietly take food and return to his hiding place. But over time, he became bolder, much bolder. According to his own statements, he would sometimes move through the house while the homeowner was there. He would listen to him, watch him, follow him from room to room without being detected. What had started as survival slowly turned into something else. Something far darker. He later described it almost like a game. The idea that he could move through the house unseen gave him a sense of power. For perhaps the first time in his life, he felt completely in control. The elderly man had no idea he wasn't actually alone. Imagine sitting in your living room reading a newspaper while a stranger watches you from above. Imagine eating dinner while someone hidden inside your walls listens to every sound. Imagine sleeping peacefully while another person quietly moves through your home. That thought alone is enough to make the story terrifying. According to investigators, the fatal confrontation happened when the homeowner unexpectedly caught him stealing food. The hidden intruder panicked. A struggle followed. And in that moment, the old man was beaten to death. Afterward, instead of fleeing, the killer returned to the attic and stayed there for months, while police searched the house, while the widow returned home, while neighbors walked past every day, while strange noises echoed through the walls. He remained hidden above everyone, watching, waiting, stealing food when he thought nobody would notice. The most disturbing part of the entire story is how ordinary it began. A lonely old man, helpful neighbors, a quiet neighborhood. Nothing about it seemed unusual. Yet hidden just a few feet above everyone's heads was a man living like a ghost inside the house. And for months, nobody knew he was there. That idea, that someone could be so close for so long without being discovered, is what makes this story so unforgettable. Even today, the thought of hearing a strange noise in an old house feels different after learning about the Denver Spider-Man. Because sometimes, the thing making noise in the attic isn't a ghost. It's something far more real. One of the creepiest stories I ever heard came from the mother of a close friend. It wasn't one of those stories that grew more dramatic every time it was told. In fact, what made it so unsettling was that she always told it exactly the same way. No matter when the topic came up, the details never changed. The look on her face never changed either. She swore it happened exactly as she remembered it. Years ago, my friend's family lived in an older house. It wasn't particularly famous or known for anything strange, but according to them, odd things happened there from time to time. Nothing that could be easily proven, just the kind of experiences that make people uncomfortable. Sometimes they would hear unexplained noises. Sometimes doors seemed to move slightly on their own. There were cold drafts that appeared in places where there shouldn't have been any. Small things would happen often enough that the family would talk about them, but never enough to make anyone seriously believe the house was haunted. Most of the incidents were easy to dismiss. A strange sound could be an old pipe. A draft could come from a hidden crack somewhere. A creaking floorboard could simply be an old house settling. Life would continue and people would move on. But there was one experience that none of them could explain. Even decades later, it remained the one event that terrified my friend's mother more than anything else. It happened late one night. The house was quiet, and everyone had already gone to bed. My friend was asleep in her own room, and her mother was sleeping alone in hers. Nothing unusual had happened that evening. It had been an ordinary day like hundreds before it. At some point during the night, her mother suddenly became aware of something. She wasn't fully awake at first. It was one of those moments where you slowly rise out of sleep because something feels different. Then she felt the mattress move. Not a violent movement, not a shake, just the very familiar feeling of someone sitting down at the end of the bed. Every parent knows that feeling. Children often wake up during the night because of a bad dream, feeling sick, or simply wanting comfort. Over the years, parents become used to the sensation of a child climbing into bed or sitting near them in the dark. That was exactly what she thought was happening. Half asleep, she assumed it was her daughter. Without feeling alarmed, she started waking up properly. She expected to see her child standing beside the bed, asking for something. Maybe she had a nightmare. Maybe she couldn't sleep. Maybe she just wanted to talk. Those were the thoughts going through her mind as she opened her eyes. But when she looked toward the end of the bed, she saw something that instantly filled her with terror. Standing there was what appeared to be her daughter. And yet, it wasn't her daughter. She later described it as a rotting version of her child. A corpse. The figure had the shape and size of her daughter, but the face was wrong. The skin appeared decayed and damaged. The eyes looked lifeless. The entire thing looked as though it had been dead for a very long time. For a moment, she couldn't move. She couldn't speak. She simply stared. The figure slowly reached toward her. That was the detail she always remembered most clearly. Not the face, not the appearance, the hand, the way it stretched toward her in the darkness. She said every instinct in her body told her that what she was seeing should not exist. The fear she felt was immediate and overwhelming. Her heart started racing. She wanted to scream, but couldn't. She wanted to run, but couldn't. All she could do was stare. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. There was no dramatic flash, no loud sound, no movement toward a doorway. One moment it was there. The next moment it was gone. The room was empty, completely empty. The only thing remaining was her terror. Most people hearing a story like this immediately assume the person must have been dreaming. That explanation would make perfect sense, except she always insisted on one thing. She wasn't asleep. She acknowledged she had been sleeping before it happened, but she maintained that by the time she saw the figure, she was fully awake. More importantly, she claimed she physically felt the mattress move. The sensation of weight sitting on the bed had been real. That was the detail she could never explain away. Years later, she would still talk about that part. The feeling, the pressure, the slight shift in the mattress. The same sensation she would have felt if her daughter had actually sat down there. That was what convinced her that the experience was different from a normal nightmare. Afterward, she checked on her daughter immediately. Of course, my friend was asleep in her own room, safe, completely unaware of what her mother had just experienced. The rest of the night was spent awake. She couldn't go back to sleep. Every shadow looked suspicious. Every creak in the house sounded louder than normal. By morning, she was exhausted, but still trying to process what had happened. The strange thing is that this wasn't the only unusual experience the family reported in that house. Over the years, there were countless little incidents. Nothing dramatic enough to make headlines. Nothing that could be recorded or proven. Just odd moments. Unexplained sounds. Footsteps when nobody was there. Cold spots in certain rooms. The feeling of being watched. The kinds of things many people experience in old houses. Most of those incidents eventually faded into family stories. This one never did. Whenever it came up, the atmosphere would change. Even after all those years, her voice would become serious. You could tell she wasn't telling it for attention. She wasn't trying to convince anyone of ghosts or spirits. She was simply describing something she believed happened. And that belief never changed. As time passed, family members developed their own theories. Some believed it was a waking dream. Others thought it might have been sleep paralysis or a vivid hallucination that occurred between sleeping and waking. A few believed it was something genuinely supernatural. No one ever reached a conclusion. The truth remained whatever it had always been, an unexplained moment in the middle of the night. What makes the story so unsettling isn't necessarily the image itself. It's the ordinary beginning. A mother sleeping peacefully. The familiar feeling of a child sitting on the edge of the bed. A completely normal moment that parents experience every day. Then, within seconds, that ordinary moment becomes something horrifying. That's why the story stayed with me. Not because of ghosts, not because of paranormal theories, but because of how quickly comfort turned into fear. A parent expects to see their child. Instead, they see something wearing the appearance of their child in the most disturbing way imaginable. Even now, years later, my friend's mother insists she remembers every detail clearly. She remembers the darkness. She remembers opening her eyes. She remembers the weight on the mattress. And most of all, she remembers looking toward the end of the bed, expecting to see her daughter, and instead finding something that should not have been there. Whatever the explanation may be, it remains the single experience from that house that she never forgot. Everything else became a strange memory. That night became a permanent one. This is one of those stories that has been passed around for years in my family. Whether every detail happened exactly as remembered, I can't say for certain. But it came from a close friend of my grandmother, and according to her, it was one of the most terrifying experiences of her life. Many years ago, my grandmother's friend and a group of women planned a weekend getaway at a lake house. It was meant to be a relaxing trip away from work, family responsibilities, and everyday stress. The cottage sat near the water, surrounded by trees and far enough from town that it felt peaceful and isolated. The women spent the first day enjoying themselves. They sat on the porch, talked for hours, cooked meals together, and enjoyed the quiet atmosphere around the lake. It was exactly the kind of weekend they had hoped for. Not far from the area, however, there was a mental institution. Most locals knew about it, but it wasn't something people thought much about. Occasionally, stories would circulate about patients wandering off or getting lost nearby, but most people assumed those were exaggerated rumors. At some point during that same weekend, a patient reportedly left the institution without permission and disappeared into the surrounding countryside. The women either didn't know about it or didn't pay much attention to the news. After all, they were there to relax, not worry about something that seemed unlikely to affect them. The second evening of the trip, one of the women wasn't feeling well. She complained of being tired and decided she wanted to stay behind at the lake house while the others went out for a while. Her friends weren't concerned. They assumed she just needed some rest. As they prepared to leave, they joked around with her the way close friends often do. One of them laughed and said something along the lines of, "Just remember, you're all alone." The others laughed as well. To them, it was harmless teasing. They had no idea that someone else might be listening. Unknown to them, the escaped patient had apparently wandered onto the property and was somewhere behind the cottage. Whether he had been hiding there for hours or had only recently arrived, nobody knew. What mattered was that he heard the conversation, and he misunderstood it completely. From his perspective, it sounded as though the women were talking directly to him. After the group left, the woman who stayed behind locked up the cottage and settled in for the evening. She wasn't feeling well, so she lay down and eventually drifted off to sleep. The lake house was quiet. Outside, the wind occasionally moved through the trees. Inside, there was only silence. At some point later that night, she suddenly woke up. At first, she wasn't sure why. She lay there for a moment, trying to figure out what had disturbed her sleep. Then she heard it. A slow, creaking sound. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Still half asleep, she listened carefully. The sound seemed to be coming from another room. It took a few moments before she recognized it. It sounded exactly like a rocking chair. Someone was sitting in a rocking chair somewhere inside the cottage, slowly rocking back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The realization immediately made her heart race. She knew she was supposed to be alone. The other women hadn't returned yet. There shouldn't have been anyone else in the house. She remained perfectly still, listening. The rocking continued. Then she heard something else. A voice, a man's voice, calm, steady, repeating the same sentence over and over again. "Just remember, you're all alone." The words were spoken slowly. Then again, "Just remember, you're all alone." And again, "Just remember, you're all alone." At first, she couldn't process what she was hearing. It sounded impossible. The phrase was exactly what her friends had jokingly said before leaving. The same words, the same order, over and over. The realization filled her with terror. Whoever was inside the house had heard that conversation. That meant he had been nearby when they left, maybe watching, maybe listening, maybe much closer than anyone had realized. The woman later said she felt completely frozen. Every instinct told her to run, but fear held her in place. She listened as the chair continued its slow movement. Back and forth, back and forth. The voice never changed. It simply repeated the phrase again and again. "Just remember, you're all alone." Minutes felt like hours. She didn't know whether the man was aware of exactly where she was. She didn't know if he planned to enter the room. She didn't know if he was dangerous. All she knew was that there was a stranger somewhere inside the cottage speaking to her through the darkness. Eventually, she found the courage to move. Accounts differ on exactly what happened next. Some versions say she managed to slip out and get help. Others say her friends returned before anything worse occurred. What everyone agrees on is that the man was eventually discovered to be the escaped patient from the nearby institution. According to the story, he had heard the women talking before they left and genuinely believed they were addressing him. The sentence became stuck in his mind, and after entering the cottage, he simply repeated it over and over while sitting in the rocking chair. No physical harm came to the woman. But that didn't make the experience any less terrifying. Years later, she still remembered waking up to that sound. Not screaming, not violence. Just the slow creak of a rocking chair moving in the darkness, and a voice calmly repeating the same sentence over and over again. Sometimes the scariest stories aren't the ones with monsters or ghosts. Sometimes it's the realization that a complete stranger was sitting only a few rooms away in the middle of the night while you slept, repeating words that were never meant for him to hear. And that thought alone is enough to make the story unforgettable. I've rewritten it in the same style you've been requesting. Simple English, smooth flow, longer storytelling format, no headings, no bold text, and staying close to the original story. Some of the scariest experiences aren't the ones where something actually happens. They're the ones where you spend years wondering what almost happened. This story happened when my son was around 6 months old. At the time, my husband and I lived in an upstairs flat. It wasn't a huge place, but it was comfortable. We were new parents, exhausted most of the time, and our lives revolved around feeding schedules, diapers, and trying to get enough sleep whenever our baby allowed it. Like many couples adjusting to parenthood, we occasionally argued about small things. Nothing serious. Just the kind of silly disagreements that happen when two tired people are trying to navigate life with a newborn. One evening, my husband and I had one of those arguments. It wasn't a major fight. Nobody was screaming. Nobody was threatening to leave. We were simply irritated with each other. After a while, I decided I needed some air. I left the flat and walked to a nearby shop to cool off. It was something I had done before. The walk wasn't very long, and it helped me clear my head. After a little while, I returned home feeling much calmer. My husband and I made up, put the argument behind us, and eventually got ready for bed. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing felt wrong. It was just another evening. Looking back now, there was one small detail that would become very important later. Normally, we always locked our front door before going to sleep. Always, it was simply part of our nightly routine. Check the baby, turn off the lights, lock the door, go to bed. But for some reason that night, the routine was broken. My husband forgot to lock the front door. Neither of us realized it. We went to sleep completely unaware that our flat was unlocked. At some point during the night, something happened. Even now, years later, it's difficult for me to explain why I woke up. I'm a very heavy sleeper, always have been. The type of person who can sleep through alarms, thunderstorms, and noise that would wake most people instantly. Yet that night, I woke up. Not fully at first. Just enough to become aware that I was hearing something. A sound, a very faint sound. Footsteps. At first I thought I might be dreaming. The house was dark. Everything looked normal. My husband was asleep beside me. My son was asleep in his cot. For a few moments I lay there listening. Then I heard it again. A slow, careful movement. Someone was coming up the stairs. The realization hit me immediately. The stairs led directly to our flat. There shouldn't have been anyone there. Every nerve in my body suddenly felt awake. I remained perfectly still, partly because I was scared, partly because I wasn't entirely sure what I was hearing. The footsteps continued. Slow, deliberate, careful, not the stumbling movements of someone crashing around. Not loud, not rushed. Whoever it was seemed to be intentionally trying not to make noise. That detail has always stayed with me. The silence, the caution, the feeling that someone knew exactly what they were doing. I listened as the person reached the top of the stairs. Then entered our flat. The front door had been left unlocked. There was nothing stopping them. My heart was pounding. I remember staring into the darkness, trying to process what was happening. I wanted to wake my husband immediately. I wanted to scream. I wanted to jump out of bed. But fear has a strange effect on people. Sometimes it makes you act. Sometimes it makes you freeze. I froze. The footsteps moved through the flat. Slowly, quietly, then they entered our bedroom. That part still gives me chills. A complete stranger was standing inside the room where my husband, my baby son, and I were sleeping. A stranger who had walked through our home without making a sound. A stranger who had reached the most private part of our home. I couldn't see much in the darkness. Only shapes, shadows, movement, but I knew someone was there. For a moment that felt endless, the person remained inside the room. To this day, I don't know what they were doing. Looking at us? Looking around? Deciding what to do next? I have no idea. Then, something changed. The person turned around. Without speaking. Without touching anything. Without waking anyone. They quietly walked back out. The footsteps moved through the flat again. Then down the stairs. Then out the front door. And they were gone. Just like that. The entire experience probably lasted only minutes. Yet it felt much longer. Once I was sure they had left, I woke my husband. The rest of the night was chaos. Fear, confusion, questions. We checked everything. We looked around the flat. We tried to understand what had happened. Nothing appeared stolen. Nothing seemed disturbed. The stranger had entered and left without taking anything. That somehow made the situation even stranger. The next day, we contacted the police. Officers came out and listened to our account. After hearing the details, they offered what they believed was the most likely explanation. According to them, it was probably a drunk person. Someone intoxicated enough to walk into the wrong home by mistake. It sounded reasonable on paper. People make mistakes. People get drunk. People open the wrong door. It happens. But something about that explanation never sat right with me. The person I heard wasn't loud. They weren't stumbling. They weren't crashing into walls. They weren't acting confused. Everything about their movements suggested awareness, purpose, control. If they were drunk, they were remarkably quiet. Far quieter than most sober people would be. The whole thing continued bothering me. Then, the following day, something happened that made the experience feel even more unsettling. I received a message on Facebook. It was from a woman who lived a few streets away. I didn't know her particularly well, but we were connected through local community groups. She told me something that immediately made my stomach drop. The week before, she had been sexually assaulted. And where it happened was what caught my attention. It happened near the park. The same park I had walked past alone the night of my argument. The same route I had taken to the shop. The same route I had walked home by myself. Suddenly, my mind started connecting dots. Maybe incorrectly, maybe unfairly, but it was impossible not to think about it. I had walked alone that evening. A stranger could have seen me. A stranger could have followed me. A stranger could have assumed I lived alone. Then, later that night, they entered my flat. Maybe they expected to find a woman by herself. Maybe they expected an easy target. And maybe, upon entering the bedroom, they discovered something they weren't expecting. A husband sleeping beside her. A baby in a cot. A family. Perhaps that was enough to make them leave. Perhaps it wasn't related at all. Perhaps the police were right. And it really was nothing more than a confused drunk person. The truth is, I'll never know. That's the hardest part. No answers. No suspect. No certainty. Only possibilities. Years have passed since that night. My son has grown up. We've moved on with our lives. But every now and then I still think about those footsteps. The careful way they moved up the stairs. The quiet entry into our bedroom. The fact that a complete stranger stood only a few feet away from my sleeping child. And the question that still lingers after all this time, why did they leave? Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe something happened in that room that changed their mind. Whatever the reason, I'm grateful they turned around and walked back out the door. Because sometimes the most frightening stories are the ones where you'll never know how close you came to something much worse. An old friend once told me a story that sounded so unbelievable the first time I heard it that I immediately assumed it had to be an urban legend. It had all the elements of one, a chance meeting, a narrow escape, a horrifying twist, and a connection to a notorious crime. If they hadn't eventually shown me the news article themselves, I probably would have dismissed it completely. The story started with a night out at a local bar. My friend and a group of her girlfriends had gone out for drinks and were doing what people in their 20s often do, relaxing after a long week, dancing, meeting people, and having fun. It wasn't a special occasion. It wasn't a birthday or holiday. It was simply one of those ordinary nights that nobody expects to remember years later. At some point during the evening, one of the women in the group caught the attention of a guy at the bar. According to everyone who met him, he was attractive, confident, and charming. The kind of person who had no trouble striking up conversations with strangers. He wasn't awkward or threatening. In fact, he was the exact opposite. That was probably part of what made the story so disturbing later. Nothing about him immediately raised alarm bells. The two of them talked for a while, laughed together, bought drinks, and eventually ended up spending much of the evening together. As the night went on, they found themselves near the dance floor. One thing led to another, and they started kissing. At first, everything seemed normal. But there was one thing she couldn't stop noticing. Something smelled off. She later described it as a strange taste and smell coming from his mouth. Not just bad breath, something different. Something unpleasant enough that it stood out even through the noise, alcohol, and excitement of the night. At the time, she didn't think much of it. People drink. People smoke. People eat strange things before going out. There were dozens of innocent explanations. She noticed it, found it odd, and moved on. As the evening continued, the man became increasingly interested in taking things further. He wanted her to leave with him. He wanted her to come back to his place. But for whatever reason, she wasn't feeling it. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe she simply wasn't interested. Maybe she was tired. Whatever the reason, she decided she wasn't going home with him. When she told him no, his attitude reportedly changed. Not dramatically, not enough to cause a scene, but enough for her to notice. The easygoing charm suddenly seemed forced. The friendliness faded. He became frustrated. The rejection clearly bothered him. That reaction only reinforced her decision. She didn't give him her phone number. She didn't exchange social media accounts. She didn't make plans to see him again. Instead, she went home. At the time, she assumed that would be the end of it. A random guy she met at a bar. An awkward goodbye. Nothing more. For about a week, that seemed to be true. Then, she developed a painful infection around her mouth. It wasn't just a small irritation. The area became inflamed. Painful blisters appeared. The symptoms became severe enough that she sought medical attention. Naturally, her first concern was that she had somehow contracted an infection through physical contact. Doctors ran tests. Given the circumstances, sexually transmitted infections were among the first possibilities considered. But according to the story, the results didn't point toward anything like that. Instead, medical staff determined she had developed a serious bacterial infection. The diagnosis confused everyone. She hadn't experienced anything similar before. The timing felt strange, yet nobody could explain exactly where it had come from. She received treatment and eventually recovered. Life moved on. Weeks passed. The strange infection became just another unpleasant memory. Then everything changed. About a month later, Members of the friend group were watching local news when they saw a familiar face. At first, nobody could quite place him. Then realization hit. It was him, the man from the bar. The same man she had spent the evening with. The same man she had kissed. The same man whose strange smell she couldn't forget. According to the report, authorities had arrested him in connection with a series of horrifying crimes. The allegations were beyond disturbing. Investigators claimed he had been targeting women, bringing them home, murdering them, and keeping parts of their remains afterward. The details shocked the entire community. Even people who didn't know him personally struggled to process the accusations. But for my friends group, the story became deeply personal. Because one of them had almost gone home with him, that realization hit everyone hard. The difference between what happened and what could have happened suddenly felt terrifyingly small. One different decision, one moment of hesitation, one change in plans. And the outcome might have been completely different. As people tried to process the news, another detail resurfaced: the infection, the smell, the strange taste she remembered while kissing him, the things she had brushed off that night. One of their friends worked in a medical field and offered a theory. It wasn't an official conclusion. It wasn't something investigators ever publicly confirmed, just a possibility. The suggestion was that the severe bacterial infection might have been connected to poor hygiene, contaminated wounds, or exposure to harmful bacteria. The friend speculated that if the allegations against him were true, there could have been contamination present that explained both the unusual smell and the infection. Whether that theory was accurate or not, nobody really knows. The truth is that there was never any way to prove the exact source of the infection. And that's important. Over the years, stories like this tend to grow larger as people retell them. Details become attached to other details. The line between confirmed facts and speculation becomes blurry. What remained certain was far simpler. A woman met a man. She spent an evening with him. Something felt slightly off. She decided not to go home with him. Later, she learned he had been arrested for horrific crimes. And suddenly, every strange detail from that night took on a completely different meaning. Looking back, the thing that always stayed with me wasn't the infection or even the news report. It was how ordinary everything seemed at the beginning. The man didn't look like a monster. He didn't act like one. He wasn't hiding in dark alleys. He wasn't lurking in the shadows. He was standing in a crowded bar, smiling, talking, laughing, and blending in with everyone else. That's often what makes stories like this so unsettling. The most dangerous people rarely announce themselves. They don't arrive wearing warning labels. They don't look different from everyone else. They often appear completely normal. And sometimes it's only after they're caught that people start replaying old memories and noticing the small details that seemed insignificant at the time. The strange smell, the sudden frustration, the uncomfortable feeling, the tiny moments that didn't make sense until later. Years after hearing the story, that's what I remember most. Not the headlines, not the investigation. Just the realization that one ordinary night at a bar almost became something much darker. And how close someone came to becoming another victim without ever realizing it. I was 12 years old when my family moved into a new house. At the time, it seemed like an exciting change. The house wasn't very large, but it was comfortable enough for our family. It was located on the second floor of a building, while the owners of the property lived on the first floor. My brother and I shared a bedroom that was connected to the kitchen. The room wasn't particularly big, but we didn't mind. Like most siblings, we spent our nights talking, arguing, laughing, and eventually falling asleep after long days at school. When we first moved in, everything seemed normal. The house looked clean and well maintained. There were no obvious signs that anything was wrong. If someone had told me then that I would later associate that place with some of the strangest experiences of my life, I would have laughed. The first unsettling thing happened before we had even fully settled in. One evening, I overheard my parents having a conversation with the owner's family. I wasn't supposed to be listening. In fact, I was pretending to be asleep nearby while secretly paying attention to every word. The owner's wife was talking about strange things that had happened in the house. She described unusual experiences that she believed were paranormal in nature. I couldn't hear every detail clearly, but I remember enough to know that she genuinely seemed frightened by whatever she had experienced. As a 12-year-old kid, that was more than enough to terrify me. Children are already good at imagining scary things. Give them a possible ghost story involving the house they're currently living in, and their imagination will do the rest. The conversation became even more unsettling when I learned that the owner's family had eventually moved out of the building. According to what I overheard, the owner's wife had become seriously ill and was later diagnosed with cancer. Eventually, she passed away. Even though there was no logical connection between her illness and the stories she told, my young mind linked everything together. From that moment on, I couldn't stop thinking about the possibility that something was wrong with the house. Every creak, every shadow, every strange noise, everything suddenly felt suspicious. For weeks, I slept with one eye open. Then one night, something happened that I still remember vividly. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. The room was completely dark. For a few seconds, I wasn't sure why I had awakened. Then I heard it. Creak, the unmistakable sound of a door slowly opening. My heart immediately started racing. The sound came from our bedroom door. At that moment, every scary story I had heard about the house rushed back into my mind. The room felt colder. The darkness felt heavier. I was lying on my side, facing away from the door. The door was directly behind me. My brother was sleeping closer to it. I remember feeling completely frozen. I wanted to turn around. I wanted to see what had caused the noise, but fear held me in place. I simply lay there, staring into the darkness, while trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. Then, I heard it again. Creak, the sound seemed even louder the second time. My entire body tensed. I knew I couldn't just lie there forever. Slowly, gathering every bit of courage I had, I turned around. The sight that greeted me did nothing to calm my nerves. The door was partially open, not wide open, just enough to make me uncomfortable. I immediately tried to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe one of my parents had checked on us. Maybe they had opened the door slightly and forgotten to close it completely. That explanation seemed reasonable enough. Feeling somewhat reassured, I turned back around and closed my eyes. I tried to force myself back to sleep. Then it happened again. The same creaking sound. Slow, deliberate, as though someone were opening the door. My eyes snapped open. I stared toward the doorway. But this time, nothing was moving. The door remained exactly where it was. Half open. Completely still. That somehow felt even worse. The sound had been real. I knew I had heard it. Yet the door wasn't moving at all. Fear and confusion mixed together inside me. Finally, I decided I had enough. With all the courage I could gather, I jumped out of bed and rushed to the light switch. The instant the room filled with light, my fear eased slightly. Everything looked normal. My brother remained fast asleep. The door stood partially open. There was nobody there. No shadows, no figures, nothing unusual. After a few minutes, I convinced myself that everything was fine. I turned the light off and climbed back into bed. At first, the silence returned. Then a new sound appeared. This time, it came from above us. Thud, scrape, thud. It sounded as if heavy furniture was being moved across the floor. The noise was unmistakable. Chairs dragging, tables shifting, something large being moved from one side of a room to another. I sat frozen beneath my blanket. The sound continued. Then it stopped. A few seconds later, it happened again. Scrape, thud, scrape. I felt my stomach twist with fear. There was just one problem. The apartment above us was empty. The family who lived there had gone on vacation days earlier. I knew this because my parents had mentioned it. There shouldn't have been anyone upstairs. Yet the sounds continued. At that point, I completely gave up trying to investigate. I pulled my blanket over my head, squeezed my eyes shut, and silently prayed for morning to arrive. I have no idea when I eventually fell asleep. Fear and exhaustion must have finally taken over. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight filled the room. Everything immediately seemed less frightening. Daylight has a way of making nighttime fears feel distant. Still, I needed answers. The first thing I did was ask whether the family upstairs had returned. My parents told me they hadn't. The apartment was still locked. Nobody had come back. That answer sent a chill through me, because if nobody was upstairs, then what had I heard? I never received an explanation. The mystery stayed with me. Unfortunately, that wasn't the end of it. Later that same day, around 6 in the evening, I left the apartment to meet some friends. The sun was beginning to set, and the building's stairwell was growing darker. I headed down the stairs as usual. Everything seemed normal. Then I looked toward the first floor. What I saw made my blood run cold. Near the doorway stood a dark figure. At first, I thought it was a person, but something about it seemed wrong. The figure appeared crouched low to the ground. It was entirely black, almost like a shadow. Around its head, there seemed to be long strands resembling hair. The shape looked unnatural, distorted, as if darkness itself had taken a human form. For one horrifying second, I stared directly at it, my body locked in place. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run, I wanted to look away. Instead, I blinked. The instant I did, the figure vanished. Completely, there was nothing there. The space was empty. I stood frozen on the stairs, trying to understand what had happened. Had I imagined it? Had it been a shadow created by the fading light? Had my fear from the previous night affected what I thought I saw? Even today, I don't know. All I know is that in that moment, it felt real. Very real. After that day, a strange feeling settled over me. I constantly felt as though someone was watching me. No matter where I went in the house, I couldn't shake the sensation. Sometimes it felt like eyes were following me from another room. Other times it felt like someone was standing just outside my field of vision. The feeling wasn't constant, but it appeared often enough that it became impossible to ignore. I stopped feeling comfortable there. My brother occasionally complained about strange noises too, though nothing as specific as what I had experienced. The atmosphere of the house seemed different. Heavy, unsettling. As months passed, other problems began affecting our family. Financial difficulties started appearing. Money became tighter. Stress increased. Arguments became more common. Looking back now, I understand that financial struggles happen to many families and aren't evidence of anything supernatural. But at 12 years old, I saw everything through a different lens. Every problem felt connected to the house. Every setback seemed like part of a larger mystery. Eventually, my family decided to move. I remember feeling relieved when we left. For the first time in a long while, I felt as though a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The strange sense of being watched gradually disappeared. Life slowly returned to normal. Years have passed since then. As an adult, I can think of many possible explanations for what happened. Doors can creak because of temperature changes. Buildings make strange noises at night. Empty apartments can produce sounds that seem impossible. Shadows can play tricks on tired eyes. Fear can influence perception. All of those explanations are reasonable. Yet despite understanding that, I still remember the feeling I had while living in that house. The fear felt real. The sounds felt real. The figure I saw on the first floor felt real. Whether those experiences were caused by imagination, coincidence, or something I simply didn't understand, I may never know. What I do know is that even now, years later, I can still picture that partially open bedroom door in the darkness. I can still hear the scraping sounds coming from the empty apartment above. And I can still remember the brief glimpse of that crouched black figure near the doorway before it vanished without a trace. Some memories fade with time. That one never did. My mother rarely tells this story, but whenever she does, it reminds everyone how quickly an ordinary day can turn into something dangerous. This happened back in the 1980s, long before cell phones, GPS tracking, home security cameras, or the countless ways people stay connected today. If something felt wrong while you were driving, there wasn't a phone in your pocket to call someone immediately. Most people simply relied on their instincts and hoped they were right. My mom was a young woman at the time and was driving home alone one evening. It had been a completely normal day. Nothing unusual had happened, and she wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. As she drove through town, she noticed a car behind her. At first, she didn't think much about it. Cars follow each other all the time. You stop at the same traffic lights. You make the same turns. It happens. But after a while, she began noticing something that felt strange. Every turn she made, the car made too. Every street she took, the car remained behind her. At first, she tried to convince herself she was imagining things. Maybe the driver just happened to be going in the same direction. Maybe he lived nearby. Maybe she was overthinking it. But the farther she drove, the more uncomfortable she became. The car never fell behind. It never turned off. It simply stayed there, a short distance behind her. Watching, following, by the time she reached her neighborhood, she was paying close attention. Her instincts were telling her something wasn't right. Even though she couldn't prove it, she had a feeling the driver wasn't simply heading home. He seemed to be following her. As she turned onto her street, the vehicle followed. When she slowed down, it slowed down. When she continued forward, it continued forward. At that point, the uneasy feeling had turned into genuine concern. She pulled into the driveway. The car behind her did not continue down the road. Instead, it stopped. Right there, on the street, just outside the house. My mother later said that was the moment she knew something was wrong. People who happen to be driving in the same direction don't usually stop outside your home. They keep going. This man didn't. He parked. For a moment, everything felt strangely quiet. She shut off her car and looked toward the street. The other driver was still sitting there. Then he opened his door. My mother got out of her vehicle. At almost the exact same time, the man got out of his. And then he started walking toward her. Not toward another house, not toward a neighbor, toward her. Looking back now, she says she immediately felt afraid. She was alone. The street wasn't crowded. And there was no obvious reason for a stranger to be approaching her after following her all the way home. Then she noticed something. Across the street stood my grandfather. My dad's family lived nearby, and my grandfather happened to be outside at that exact moment. Whether he was doing yard work, talking to someone, or simply standing outside. She couldn't remember years later. What mattered was that he was there, and the stranger could see him. Without hesitating, my mother raised her hand and shouted loudly, "Hi, Dad." Then she waved enthusiastically. She wanted the man approaching her to believe exactly what was true, that someone nearby knew her, recognized her, and was paying attention. The reaction was immediate. The stranger stopped. For a brief second, he seemed to reconsider whatever he had planned. Then he turned around. He walked quickly back to his vehicle, got inside, and sped away, just like that. No explanation, no conversation, no reason given for why he had followed her home. He simply left. At the time, my mother was shaken, but she still didn't know exactly what had happened. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the man had some innocent explanation. Maybe she had misunderstood the situation. People often try to rationalize frightening experiences after they're over. It's a way of making themselves feel better. The problem was that later that same night, she got an answer she never wanted. The story appeared on the news. Authorities were warning women in the area about a man who had reportedly been following women home and attacking them. The description matched what she had experienced: a stranger following women, waiting until they arrived home, approaching them when they were alone. The realization hit her hard. The encounter she'd spent the day trying to explain away suddenly looked very different. The man hadn't randomly ended up behind her. He hadn't coincidentally stopped outside her house. He hadn't accidentally approached her driveway. He had likely chosen her. And the only reason he left was because he suddenly believed she wasn't alone. My mother has said many times that if my grandfather hadn't been standing across the street, she has no idea what would have happened. Maybe the man would have continued approaching. Maybe he would have attacked her. Maybe she would have found another way to get inside safely. Nobody knows. And that's exactly what makes the story so unsettling. The outcome may have been determined by a matter of seconds. A chance moment. One familiar face standing outside at the right time. One quick decision to call out loudly. One reminder to a stranger that someone was watching. The frightening thing about stories like this is how ordinary they begin. No dramatic warning signs, no obvious danger, just a normal drive home after a normal day. Then suddenly a person realizes they aren't alone. Someone is behind them. Someone is watching. Someone has followed them all the way to their front door. Decades have passed since that evening. The roads have changed. The neighborhood has changed. The world has changed. But my mother still remembers the feeling she had when she saw that car stop outside her house. And she still remembers how quickly the man left when he realized another person was nearby. Whenever she tells the story now, she always says the same thing. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, pay attention to that feeling. Because sometimes the difference between becoming a victim and getting home safely can be one decision, one observation, or one person appearing at exactly the right moment. For my mother, that person happened to be her father standing across the street. And because of that, what could have become a tragedy became a story she was able to tell for the rest of her life. One of the strangest memories from my childhood happened during a family vacation. And even now, more than 20 years later, I still think about it from time to time. I was around 10 years old at the time. My family had gone on vacation, and one evening my aunt decided to take me and my younger cousin to the boardwalk in Wildwood. If you've ever been there, you know how exciting it can be for a kid. The place was packed with lights, rides, games, music, and people everywhere. Everything felt larger than life. My cousin was a few years younger than me, probably 3 or 4 years younger. Like most kids on vacation, we were running around excitedly, trying to fit in as many rides as possible before it was time to leave. At some point, we decided to ride Dante's Dungeon. It was one of those classic haunted attractions that mix dark ride elements with jump scares and spooky effects. I'd actually been on it before, so I wasn't particularly nervous. I already knew most of it was designed to scare people for fun. At least, that's what I thought. We got into the ride vehicle together and started moving through the attraction. Everything seemed completely normal at first. There were flashing lights, creepy decorations, fake monsters, and all the usual haunted house effects. My cousin and I laughed through most of it because we knew it was supposed to be scary. Then we entered a section that was completely dark. And I mean completely dark. Not the kind of darkness where your eyes eventually adjust. The kind where you can't see your own hand in front of your face. The cart continued moving forward slowly. For a few seconds, all I could hear was the sound of the ride itself. Then, I heard a man's voice. At first, I thought it was part of the attraction. That wouldn't have been unusual. Haunted rides often have hidden speakers playing sounds or dialogue, but this sounded different. The voice wasn't coming from somewhere ahead of us. It wasn't echoing through the attraction. It sounded like it was right behind me. Close, very close. Close enough that I could almost feel someone leaning toward me. The voice casually asked me my name. At first, I didn't answer. I remember feeling confused more than scared. Then he asked another question. How are you doing? Are you having fun? Random conversational questions. The kind of things someone might ask while standing next to you in line for a ride. Not the kind of things you'd expect to hear from an unseen stranger in total darkness. I immediately became uncomfortable. The darkness made it impossible to understand where the voice was actually coming from. Everything felt disorienting. My sense of direction was completely gone. For some reason, the thing that worried me most wasn't the voice itself. It was my cousin. The voice seemed to be coming from the exact side where my cousin had been sitting. Because of the darkness, I couldn't see him. I couldn't even tell if he was still next to me. I remember asking where my cousin was. Looking back now, it sounds like a strange question. But when you're 10 years old, sitting in complete darkness, hearing an unfamiliar adult voice only inches away from you, your brain doesn't always react logically. The man immediately answered. Oh, he's right here. Don't worry. That sentence is what has stayed with me all these years. Not because it was threatening, not because he yelled it. Quite the opposite. He sounded calm, almost friendly. And somehow that made it worse. I remember feeling a wave of fear hit me. My stomach dropped. The ride was still moving, but suddenly I wasn't paying attention to any of the haunted house effects anymore. I didn't care about the fake monsters. I didn't care about the decorations. All I wanted was for the ride to end. The darkness seemed endless. Every second felt much longer than it probably was. I remember sitting completely still, waiting for us to come out of that section. Then, finally, we emerged into a brighter area. The ride lights returned. I immediately looked around. There was nobody there. Nobody standing near us. Nobody sitting with us. Nobody visible anywhere close enough to explain what had happened. It was just me and my cousin. The cart continued moving as though nothing unusual had occurred. I kept looking around, trying to make sense of it. Had it been an employee? Had someone somehow leaned into the ride? Had there been a hidden speaker? Nothing I saw seemed to fit what I had experienced. The voice had sounded too close, too personal, too direct. It felt like someone had been right next to me. Yet there was nobody there. When the ride finally ended, I couldn't stop thinking about it. My cousin and I talked about it briefly, but he didn't seem nearly as affected as I was. Maybe because he was younger. Maybe because he experienced it differently. Or maybe because some memories attach themselves more strongly to one person than another. The rest of the evening continued normally. We went on other rides, walked around the boardwalk, played games, ate food. But in the back of my mind, I kept replaying that moment. The voice, the darkness, the strange response when I asked about my cousin. Eventually, we returned to the beach house where the family was staying. As soon as I had the chance, I told my dad what happened. At the time, I expected him to laugh it off or tell me it was part of the ride. Instead, his reaction surprised me. He became very serious, immediately serious. He started asking question after question. Did the man touch you? Did he grab you? Did he stick you with anything? Did you feel anything? Did anything happen besides him talking? At 10 years old, I didn't understand why he was asking those questions. I remember being confused. To me, the strange part was simply hearing the voice. I couldn't understand why my dad seemed so concerned about details that hadn't even crossed my mind. Eventually, the conversation ended because there wasn't much else to say. Nothing physical had happened. At least nothing I was aware of. The strange voice remained unexplained. Life moved on. Years passed. Then decades. And now, as a parent myself, I understand my father's reaction completely differently. Looking back through adult eyes, I realize he wasn't focused on the mystery. He was focused on safety. He immediately started thinking about worst-case scenarios. How close was the voice? Could someone have reached into the ride? Could an employee have acted inappropriately? Could a stranger have somehow gotten access to the attraction? Questions that never would have occurred to a 10-year-old child immediately occurred to him as a parent. And honestly, now that I have children of my own, I probably would have asked the exact same questions. That realization changes the memory somewhat. When I was young, I viewed the experience as creepy. Now I view it as both creepy and unsettling for entirely different reasons. The truth is, I still don't know what happened. There may be a perfectly reasonable explanation. Maybe an employee was hidden nearby and interacting with riders. Maybe there was a ride effect I never noticed. Maybe someone was using a hidden microphone or speaker. Maybe the darkness simply distorted my perception of where the voice was coming from. All of those explanations are possible, but none of them fully erase how the experience felt in that moment. Because memory isn't always about what happened. Sometimes it's about how something felt. And what I remember most clearly isn't the ride itself. It's sitting in complete darkness, hearing an unfamiliar adult voice speak directly into what felt like my ear, asking where my cousin was, and hearing the response, "He's right here. Don't worry." 25 years later, that's still enough to send a chill down my spine. Not because I believe anything supernatural happened. Not because I think there was some hidden monster inside the attraction. But because for a few moments in the darkness, something happened that I never fully understood. And sometimes the memories that stay with us the longest are the ones that never receive a clear explanation. This is one of those stories that becomes more unsettling the more you think about it afterward. At first, it sounds like a simple encounter between a determined older woman and a trespasser. But once the identity of that stranger became known, the entire memory took on a completely different meaning. Back in the 1970s, I had a girlfriend whose grandmother lived in a very isolated area. Her home sat far away from other houses, surrounded by fields and open land. It was the kind of place where privacy came naturally, because there simply weren't many people around. If someone drove by, you noticed. If someone walked across your property, you definitely noticed. The nearest neighbors weren't close enough to hear shouting or see what was happening around the house. If trouble ever came, help wouldn't be arriving in a matter of minutes. People who lived in places like that understood they often had to rely on themselves. My girlfriend's grandmother was exactly that kind of person. She had lived in the countryside for years and knew every corner of the property. She knew which sounds belonged there and which didn't. She wasn't easily intimidated, and she wasn't the type to ignore something suspicious. One afternoon, she was at home going about her normal routine. It was an ordinary day, and there was no reason to expect anything unusual. Then, she noticed movement out in one of the fields near her property. At first, she assumed it might be an animal, but as she looked closer, she realized it was a man. He wasn't walking along a road. He wasn't approaching from a driveway. He was coming directly out of the field. That immediately caught her attention. The area was isolated enough that strangers rarely appeared without a reason. Most people who visited either called ahead, knew the family, or arrived in a vehicle. A lone man emerging from a field was unusual enough to raise concerns. The closer he got, the more uncomfortable she became. She didn't recognize him. She had never seen him before, and he had no obvious reason to be there. Rather than waiting to see what happened, she decided to handle the situation herself. She went inside, retrieved her shotgun, and stepped out onto the porch. According to the story that was later told in the family, she stood there holding the gun in plain sight while watching the stranger approach. The man eventually came close enough for them to speak. She didn't greet him politely. She didn't ask if he needed directions. She didn't invite him onto the property. Instead, she told him directly that he had no business being there and that he needed to leave. There was no uncertainty in her voice. She wasn't asking. She was telling him. The stranger reportedly looked at her for a moment. Whether he was surprised, annoyed, or simply evaluating the situation, nobody knows. What is known is that he did not continue approaching. He didn't argue. He didn't threaten her. He didn't try to force his way onto the property. Instead, he turned around and left. My girlfriend's grandmother remained on the porch with a shotgun in her hands until he was completely gone from sight. Once he disappeared, she went back inside and continued with her day. At the time, she probably thought very little of it. Living in rural areas often means occasionally dealing with people wandering onto property, hunters crossing land, or strangers taking shortcuts through fields. It was unusual, but not necessarily something she expected to remember for the rest of her life. Then, sometime later, she saw a face in the news, and everything changed. Authorities had finally captured a man who had been wanted in connection with multiple murders across several states. His name was Paul John Knowles. Later known as the Casanova Killer, he was responsible for a series of murders committed while traveling across the country during the 1970s. When news reports showed his photograph, my girlfriend's grandmother immediately recognized him. It was the same man she had confronted on her property, the same man she had ordered to leave, the same man who had walked out of the field toward her house. Suddenly, what had seemed like an ordinary encounter no longer felt ordinary at all. Instead of being some random stranger, the man standing in front of her had allegedly been one of the most dangerous fugitives in the country at the time. That realization hit hard. Because once she knew who he was, 1,000 uncomfortable possibilities came with that knowledge. Why had he been there? Was he simply passing through? Was he looking for help? Was he searching for a place to hide? Or had he chosen that isolated house for a far darker reason? No one could answer those questions. The truth disappeared with him. But what made the story so frightening was how vulnerable the situation could have been. She lived alone in an isolated location. There were no nearby witnesses, no neighbors watching from across the street, no one who would have immediately noticed if something went wrong. If events had unfolded differently, it might have been hours before anyone realized there was a problem. Yet the encounter ended with nothing more than a brief confrontation. Some family members later joked that the shotgun probably changed his mind very quickly. Others believed her confidence was what mattered most. People looking for easy victims often avoid situations where they meet immediate resistance. Whatever the reason, he left. And because he left, the story became a chilling memory instead of a tragedy. Years later, the family would still talk about it. Not because anything dramatic happened during the encounter itself, but because of what could have happened. That's what makes stories like this linger. At the time, it was just a strange man appearing out of a field. Only afterward did it become a close encounter with someone whose name would eventually appear in newspapers across the country. And that's often the most unsettling part about real life. Danger rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with dramatic music or obvious warning signs. Sometimes it looks like an ordinary stranger walking across a field on an ordinary afternoon. And only years later do you realize how close you may have come to something terrible. My girlfriend's grandmother never considered herself a hero. She always told the story as though she simply did what anyone should do. A stranger appeared where he didn't belong. She told him to leave. He left. End of story. But knowing what we know now, it's hard not to wonder how differently things might have ended if she hadn't been standing on that porch with a shotgun in her hands, and the confidence to use it if necessary. I still get chills from this story, even though it sounds so simple compared to some of the other stories people tell. My aunts and uncle used to own a huge house deep in the woods. And when I say deep in the woods, I mean truly isolated. The nearest town wasn't just a few minutes away. You had to drive nearly 45 minutes to get anywhere that resembled civilization. There were no neighbors within shouting distance, no streetlights, and no comforting sounds of traffic in the distance. Once the sun went down, the darkness felt complete. As kids, all of us cousins loved visiting that place. During the day, it was amazing. There were endless acres of woods to explore, trails to walk, old sheds to investigate, and enough space to run around for hours without seeing another person. It felt like an adventure every time we visited. But at night, the property became a completely different place. The same woods that felt exciting during daylight suddenly felt enormous and mysterious after sunset. The trees seemed taller. The shadows looked deeper. Every sound carried differently. Even the adults would lock the doors earlier than usual and make sure everyone was inside before it got too late. One particular night has stayed with me for nearly 20 years. We had spent the entire day outside and were getting ready to leave. It was late. The adults were inside talking while a few of us cousins walked out toward the cars parked near the driveway. The night was unusually quiet. There wasn't any wind, no sounds of animals, no distant traffic, just silence. The kind of silence you only get when you're far away from everything. My older brother was with us. Like most teenagers, he was messing around, trying to entertain himself while waiting for everyone else. As we walked toward the car, he started whistling. It wasn't anything special, just a random whistle into the darkness. The sound traveled much farther than it would have in town. You could hear it echoing through the trees. The whistle disappeared into the woods, and then everything went quiet again. A few seconds later, we heard a whistle come back. Not an echo. A whistle. A distinct whistle from somewhere out in the darkness. Every single one of us froze. At first, nobody said anything. We all looked at each other. For a moment, nobody wanted to be the first person to acknowledge what we had just heard. The whistle had sounded deliberate. Not like a bird, not like wind moving through branches. It sounded exactly like somebody responding. The woods beyond the driveway were pitch black. There were no lights, no houses, nothing visible at all. Just rows of dark trees stretching into the distance. The silence that followed felt much heavier than before. I remember feeling my stomach drop. It was one of those moments where your brain instantly starts trying to come up with explanations. Maybe it was another family member. Maybe someone else was outside. Maybe we imagined it. Maybe it came from farther away than it sounded. But none of those explanations felt right. My brother stared into the darkness for a moment. Then he laughed nervously. The kind of laugh people make when they're uncomfortable and trying to convince themselves everything is normal. To test it, he whistled again. The sound carried out into the woods. We all waited. Nothing. No response. Just silence. That somehow made it worse. If someone had answered again, maybe we could have figured something out. Maybe it would have revealed itself as another person. Maybe we would have spotted someone walking nearby. Instead, there was absolutely nothing. No movement, no voices, no footsteps, no second whistle, just complete darkness. I remember all of us standing there for a few seconds longer than necessary. Nobody wanted to admit they were scared. Nobody wanted to be the first person to suggest going back inside. But the mood had completely changed. The joking stopped. The conversation stopped. Suddenly, everyone seemed much more interested in getting into the car. As soon as the adults came outside, we piled in much faster than we normally would have. The drive away from the property felt oddly comforting. The farther we got from the woods, the better everyone seemed to feel. Eventually, the conversation shifted to other things, and life moved on. But the incident never fully left my mind. The strange thing is that nothing actually happened. Nobody got hurt. Nobody saw a figure standing among the trees. There was no chase through the woods, no terrifying discovery. Just a whistle, a single whistle. And yet it's one of the memories that has stayed with me the longest. Over the years, I've tried to think of logical explanations. Maybe there was another person somewhere on the property. Maybe a hunter was nearby. Maybe someone else happened to be out in the woods. Maybe the sound traveled in a way that made it seem closer than it really was. All of those explanations are possible. But what makes the memory stick isn't the mystery itself. It's the feeling. That sudden shift from feeling completely safe to feeling watched. The realization that there might have been somebody out there in the darkness while we stood in the open. And because we never found out who or what made that whistle, the moment never really got closure. Looking back now as an adult, I understand that it was probably something explainable. Most strange experiences usually are. But memory doesn't care much about logic. Memory cares about emotion. And the emotion I remember most clearly from that night was the overwhelming feeling that something out there had answered. Not echoed. Answered. Nearly 2 decades have passed since then. I've experienced far scarier things in life. I've dealt with real emergencies, real danger, and real problems. Yet somehow, every now and then, I'll remember that quiet night in the woods. I'll remember my brother's whistle disappearing into the darkness. And I'll remember the whistle that came back. Even now, just thinking about it gives me chills. Maybe because some mysteries don't need a dramatic ending to stay with you. Sometimes all it takes is a single sound coming from a place where nobody should have been. A single response from the darkness, and a question that never gets answered. I was 16 years old when this happened. It was supposed to be one of those carefree summer evenings that you remember for good reasons. A city festival was taking place nearby, and like a lot of teenagers, my friends and I wanted to be there. We spent the day walking around, enjoying the atmosphere, listening to music, and just having fun together. At that age, you don't think much about danger. You feel like the world is wide open and that bad things happen somewhere else, to other people, not to anyone connected to your life. As the evening went on, my friends and I eventually made our way toward the train station. We had been walking around for hours, and by that point we were tired but still in good spirits. We grabbed something to drink and sat around waiting for our train. The station wasn't particularly busy, and the mood among us was relaxed. We were laughing, telling stories, and talking about random things the way teenagers do when they don't have any real responsibilities waiting for them. Then, something caught our attention. An ambulance suddenly sped past us, with its lights flashing. Right behind it were other emergency vehicles rushing in the same direction. We watched them disappear down a nearby street. Even from where we were sitting, we could see the flashing blue lights reflecting off buildings in the distance. For a few moments we talked about it, wondering what might have happened. But then, we moved on. We were 16. Emergencies happen. Someone could have had an accident. Maybe there was a fight somewhere. Maybe somebody got hurt. Whatever it was, it felt far away from us. For the next 50 minutes or so, we remained at the station waiting for our train. The flashing lights were still visible in the distance, but none of us paid much attention to them anymore. Eventually, our train arrived, we got on, and we went home. At the time, I had absolutely no idea that while I was sitting there laughing with my friends, someone I knew was fighting for his life only a short distance away. It wasn't until later that I learned what had actually happened. Two best friends, who I'll call M and H, had been on their way to the exact same city festival that evening. They were young, just like us. They weren't heading there looking for trouble. They simply wanted to enjoy the night and spend time together. But unlike my friends and me, they never made it there. On their way to the festival, they were confronted by a group of men who had apparently been waiting for them. From what people later said, this wasn't a random encounter. The group had a specific reason for targeting M. He owed one of the men money. Not a fortune. Not thousands of euros. Just 50 euros. An amount so small that when you hear it today, it almost sounds impossible that anyone would lose their life over it. But that debt was enough. The men surrounded M and H. According to reports, they positioned themselves in a way that left the two friends with almost no chance of getting away. The situation escalated quickly. Arguments were exchanged. Tempers rose. And then one of the men pulled out a machete. Even now, years later, that detail still feels shocking to me. Most people imagine arguments ending with shouting, maybe a punch being thrown. Very few people expect a weapon like that to suddenly appear. At some point during the confrontation, H did something that would define how everyone remembered him afterward. Instead of running, instead of stepping away, instead of protecting himself, he stepped in front of his best friend. Whether it was instinct, loyalty, courage, or all three, nobody can really say. What we do know is that he placed himself between danger and someone he cared about. And that decision cost him his life. The man with a weapon didn't hesitate. He attacked. The situation became chaos almost instantly. People living nearby heard the commotion. Some residents came out onto balconies overlooking the street. Others looked through windows. Several witnesses watched the entire thing unfold from above. They saw the attack. They saw what happened afterward. And they were the ones who called emergency services. That was the ambulance we had seen rushing past us. That was the blue, flashing light we had ignored while waiting for our train. While we sat there joking and laughing, help was already on the way to a scene that was only a short distance away. The details that came out later made the story even more heartbreaking. According to M, emergency crews arrived quickly. The ambulance was there. Help had reached the scene. But the attackers weren't finished. Witness accounts and later reports suggested that some members of the group remained nearby, armed with weapons. M later claimed they stood between the victim and the people trying to save him, while emergency workers were present, while help was literally there. H was lying on the ground, fighting for his life. Minutes passed. Minutes that mattered. Minutes that could never be given back. And eventually, despite everyone's efforts, he died. By the time the attackers finally scattered and fled in different directions, the damage had already been done. At almost that exact same moment, my friends and I were climbing onto our train. We had no idea what had happened. We had no idea that the flashing lights belonged to an event that would shock the entire area. We had no idea that someone we knew would never come home. The next days were filled with rumors, news reports, and conversations that seemed impossible to process. Stories spread quickly. People wanted answers. Everyone was asking the same questions. How could something like this happen? Why would anyone go that far? How does a disagreement over money end in someone's death? As investigators worked through the case, more information slowly became public. The suspects didn't disappear forever. Over the following weeks, police tracked down and arrested the main attacker, along with several people connected to the incident. The arrests brought some measure of accountability, but they couldn't change what had happened. Nothing could. A young man was gone. A family had lost a son. Friends had lost someone they loved. And one best friend was left carrying a burden most people could never imagine. Of everyone involved, M may have suffered in ways outsiders couldn't fully understand. Imagine living with the knowledge that someone stepped in front of danger to protect you. Imagine knowing that a person you cared about sacrificed himself because he refused to abandon you. Most people would struggle to process something like that. From what I heard, M didn't cope well afterward. And honestly, who could blame him? The trauma of the attack, the grief, the guilt, the memories, it all seemed to overwhelm him. Over time, people said he began to fall apart emotionally. His life changed. Eventually, he was admitted somewhere for treatment. After that, news about him became scarce. The last thing I ever heard was that he was trying to rebuild his life, but I never saw him again. Years have passed since that night. The city festival has happened many times since then. People still gather. Music still plays. Teenagers still laugh and walk through the streets believing they have all the time in the world. And every time I think about that evening, I remember how close we were to everything. Just one street away. 50 minutes of waiting at a train station. Flashing lights in the distance. An ambulance racing past. At the time, it was just background noise to us, a minor interruption in an otherwise fun night. But for someone else, it was the worst night of their life. What stays with me more than anything isn't the violence. It's the loyalty. It's the image of H stepping forward when he could have stepped back. The image of someone refusing to abandon his best friend, even when doing so, might have saved his own life. Most friendships are measured through years of conversations, shared experiences, and memories. But some are measured by actions, by moments, by choices made in seconds. H made a choice that night. He saw danger coming and put himself in front of it. And whether people knew him personally or not, that act left an impression that never really faded. Whenever I think about the story now, I don't think about the debt. I don't think about the arrests. I don't even think about the attackers. I think about two friends who left home expecting nothing more than a fun evening together. One of them never came back. And the reason he didn't is because he chose to stand between his best friend and a blade. There is something deeply heartbreaking about that kind of loyalty. It's the kind of story that reminds you how fragile life can be, but also how powerful friendship can be. And that's why, Even all these years later, it still hits differently every time I remember it. Some of the strangest stories I've ever heard came from my mom's side of the family. What makes them especially unusual is that my family is extremely religious. Most of them are devoted Christians who generally don't believe in paranormal stories, psychic abilities, mediums, or anything remotely connected to the supernatural outside of their religious beliefs. That's why the stories about my great-grandmother have always stood out. She was my grandmother's mother, and although she passed away long before I was old enough to know her, I've spent my entire life hearing stories about her. What's interesting is that these stories don't come from random people. They come directly from family members who normally dismiss ghost stories and paranormal claims without a second thought. Yet whenever my great-grandmother came up in conversation, their tone would change. They would lower their voices. They would speak carefully. And they would tell stories that didn't fit with anything else they believed. According to my grandmother and my mother, my great-grandmother was known for things nobody could explain. Depending on who was telling the story, she was described as spiritual, gifted, a medium, or something much stranger. Some family members avoided putting a label on it altogether because they weren't sure what to call it. Whatever it was, they believed she could do things they had never seen anyone else do. Growing up, I heard stories about her talking to people who weren't physically there. Family members claimed she would sometimes carry on conversations with empty parts of a room as if another person was standing beside her. When questioned, she supposedly acted as though nothing unusual was happening. There were stories about her knowing things she shouldn't have known. Stories about strange predictions. Stories about objects moving. Stories about houses where unusual things seemed to happen constantly. Normally, I would assume these stories had simply grown over time, becoming bigger and stranger with each generation. Families do that. One unusual event turns into a legend after enough years pass. But what always made me pause was how seriously my mother and grandmother spoke about it. Neither of them seemed interested in exaggerating. In fact, both of them appeared uncomfortable discussing it. One story in particular stayed with me because my mother insisted she witnessed it herself. According to her, she was still a young child when it happened. She had been visiting her grandmother's house, sitting with family members around a table. Nothing unusual was happening at the time. It was an ordinary family gathering, the kind that happened regularly. At some point, the conversation turned toward the strange things people claimed my great-grandmother could do. My mother remembers people talking about it casually, almost as if it were normal. Then someone challenged her. My great-grandmother apparently smiled and placed her fingertips lightly against the edge of the table. According to my mother, she began repeating the phrase, light as a feather. Again and again. Light as a feather. The room became quiet. Everyone watched. My mother says that after a few moments, the table began to move. Not slide, not tilt. Lift, she claims the entire table slowly rose off the floor. At first, only slightly. Then higher, until it was several feet above the ground. My mother insists she saw it with her own eyes. Even decades later, she tells the story exactly the same way. Every detail remains unchanged. And every time she tells it, she sounds just as confused by it as she did when she was a child. The strange thing is that my mother isn't the type of person who normally believes in paranormal stories. If someone else told her about a levitating table, she would probably dismiss it immediately. Yet, this is one experience she never backed away from. She simply says she saw what she saw and has never been able to explain it. As strange as that story is, it wasn't the only thing family members associated with my great-grandmother. According to my mother, every house they lived in seemed to develop a reputation for strange activity. No matter where they moved, no matter how different the house was. The stories followed them. My mother spent part of her childhood and teenage years in several different homes, and she says unusual things happened in all of them. Not every day, not constantly, but often enough that family members noticed. One of the most common experiences involved sounds. Late at night, after everyone had gone to bed, people would hear footsteps. Not quiet footsteps, heavy ones. The kind that sound like someone running through a house. My mother remembers lying awake in bed as a teenager and hearing what sounded like a person sprinting down the stairs. She said the sound was unmistakable. Fast footsteps. Then, a loud impact. The landing at the bottom of the staircase would shake as if someone had jumped the final few steps and landed heavily. The first few times she heard it, she assumed someone else in the family was awake. Maybe one of her siblings, maybe an adult, maybe someone getting up for water. But whenever she checked, everyone was asleep. The house would be completely quiet, nothing out of place, no explanation. Then it would happen again another night. The same running, the same heavy impact. The same feeling that somebody was moving through the house. Eventually, she became so used to it that she would simply stay in bed and wait for the sound to stop. But that didn't make it any less unsettling. The noises weren't the only strange occurrences. Furniture was another common topic of conversation. My mother claims family members would occasionally wake up to discover things had been moved overnight. At first, they blamed one another. Someone must have rearranged something. Someone must have forgotten. Someone must have moved a chair and not remembered doing it. But some situations were harder to explain. One morning, my mother came downstairs and found the dining room looking completely different. The chairs were no longer around the table. Every single chair had been moved away from it. Not randomly, not knocked over. Placed, each chair had been positioned in a corner of the room as if someone had carefully arranged them during the night. The table remained where it was. Only the chairs had moved. No one admitted to doing it. No one claimed responsibility. Everyone denied getting up during the night. The family spent the morning arguing about it before eventually giving up. The chairs were moved back. Life continued. But the incident became another story added to a growing collection of unexplained memories. As the years passed, the stories continued to build. Cold spots, strange noises, objects appearing in different places, feelings of being watched, footsteps when nobody was there, furniture moving, and always, somehow, these stories seemed connected to my great-grandmother. Whether that connection was real or simply the result of family legend, nobody could say. What makes these stories interesting to me isn't whether they're true in a paranormal sense. It's how consistently they were told by people who normally rejected that kind of thing. My family wasn't looking for ghosts. They weren't visiting haunted locations. They weren't interested in proving supernatural theories. If anything, they were skeptical. Which is why the stories about my great-grandmother always felt different. They weren't being told by people who wanted to believe. They were being told by people who didn't know what to believe. Even now, years later, whenever the topic comes up, the same stories are told. The levitating table, the footsteps on the stairs, the furniture moving overnight, the strange atmosphere that seemed to follow my great-grandmother from house to house. Maybe there are explanations for all of it. Maybe memories changed over time. Maybe ordinary events became extraordinary through years of retelling. Or maybe something genuinely strange was happening around her. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that generations of my family continue telling the same stories, and every person who tells them sounds just as puzzled as the person before. And sometimes, the fact that nobody can explain something is what makes it stay alive for so many years. I've rewritten it in your requested style. Simple English, smooth flow, longer narrative, no headings, no bold text, and staying close to the original story. Years ago, when I was younger and traveling around the western United States, I spent a lot of time hitchhiking. Looking back now, it probably wasn't the safest way to get around, but at the time it felt like an adventure. Every ride came with a new story, a new place, and a new person to meet. Most of the people I encountered were ordinary. Some were friendly, some were strange, and a few were unforgettable. One couple I met has stayed in my memory for more than 15 years, not because of who they were, but because of a story they told me. The couple looked exactly how you might imagine people who had spent years drifting from place to place. They were rough around the edges, heavy drinkers, and seemed to live one day at a time. They argued often, laughed loudly, and told stories that sounded almost too bizarre to be true. At first, I didn't know what to make of them. Like many people you meet while traveling, they seemed to exist in their own world. One evening, while we were sitting around talking, the conversation turned towards strange experiences on the road. People who travel constantly usually collect unusual stories. Most involve bad weather, dangerous rides, creepy strangers, or strange places. Then, the couple told me something that completely changed the mood. According to them, this happened while they were hitchhiking through a rural area somewhere in the western United States. They couldn't remember exactly where, or at least they claimed they couldn't. They had caught a ride during the day and eventually been dropped off on a quiet stretch of road near sunset. The area was mostly farmland. There weren't many houses nearby, no towns within walking distance, just open land stretching toward the horizon. As darkness started approaching, they began looking for somewhere to spend the night. This wasn't unusual for them. They had done it countless times before. Sometimes they slept outside. Sometimes they found abandoned buildings. Sometimes they found old barns, wherever they could safely rest until morning. As they walked along the road, they noticed an old farmhouse sitting by itself in the distance. From what they described, the place looked abandoned. The property appeared neglected. The fields around it were overgrown. The house itself showed signs of years of decay. Broken windows, peeling paint, the sort of building people normally avoid. But for travelers looking for shelter, it looked perfect. They made their way toward it. As they got closer, the silence became more noticeable. No lights, no vehicles, no signs that anyone had lived there for a very long time. Eventually, they reached the front door. To their surprise, it wasn't locked. One of them pushed it open. The house was dark and smelled old. Dust covered everything. Furniture remained inside, but it looked untouched for years. The couple assumed they had found exactly what they were looking for, an abandoned place to spend the night. So, they stepped inside. At first, nothing seemed particularly unusual. The house looked like countless other abandoned buildings. Quiet, empty, forgotten. Then they began exploring, room by room, looking for a place to sleep. Eventually, they reached one of the bedrooms, and that's when everything changed. According to the story they told me, there was a woman lying on a bed. At first, they thought it was a mannequin or some kind of prank. Then they realized it wasn't. The woman was dead. Very dead. Not recently. Not even close. Her remains had been there for a long time. Years, perhaps. Maybe longer. The details they described were disturbing. She appeared to be restrained, tied to the bed. The condition of the remains suggested violence. Even after all that time, they believed it was obvious she had been murdered. The room itself had become a kind of tomb. The woman remained exactly where she had been left, alone, forgotten, hidden away from the world. The couple told me they immediately fled the house. They ran outside and didn't stop until they were a safe distance away. That part I could understand. Most people would react exactly the same way. Finding human remains unexpectedly would terrify anyone. What disturbed me wasn't that they left. It was what happened afterward. Or rather, what didn't happen. They never reported it. Not that night. Not the next day. Not ever. According to them, they simply found another place to sleep and continued traveling. At first I thought they were joking. I assumed I had misunderstood. Surely anyone who discovered something like that would contact authorities, even if they were scared, even if they were nervous, even if they wanted to leave the area immediately. Instead, they explained their reasoning. They said they didn't want to become suspects. They didn't want police asking questions. They didn't want to get involved. The explanation made no sense to me. Even then, even now, the woman had clearly been dead for a very long time. The couple were travelers passing through. They had never been in that area before. There was no logical reason to think they would somehow be blamed for a crime involving remains that had likely been there for years. But fear makes people behave irrationally. Instead of making a report, they simply walked away. And that's the part that has haunted me ever since. Not the farmhouse, not the body, not even the possibility that a murderer had once lived nearby. What stays with me is the image of that woman remaining there, waiting, year after year, completely unknown to the outside world. Every missing person belongs to someone. A daughter, a sister, a mother, a friend. Someone somewhere remembers them. Someone wonders what happened. Someone hopes for answers. And that's what troubled me most when I heard the story. If it was true, then somewhere there could have been people still searching for her. People still wondering. People still checking old photographs. Still hoping for a phone call. Still believing she might somehow be found alive. Meanwhile, according to the couple's story, she had already been found. But the people who found her said nothing. I remember arguing with them about it. Not aggressively. Just trying to understand. Trying to make sense of a decision that felt impossible to justify. They simply shrugged. To them, it had happened years earlier. It was over. There was nothing they could do now. The conversation moved on to other topics. But my thoughts didn't. Even after all these years, I still think about it occasionally. Part of me wonders whether the story was true at all. Travelers tell a lot of stories. Some are exaggerated, some are misunderstood, some are completely invented. Maybe this was one of those stories. Maybe they wanted attention. Maybe they combined pieces of different experiences into one dramatic tale. I honestly don't know. But another part of me worries that it really happened. Because if it did, then somewhere out there may have been an abandoned farmhouse hiding a terrible secret. A woman whose life ended violently. A family that never received answers. A crime scene that remained undiscovered. And perhaps the most tragic part of all is that the opportunity to help was right there. 2 people stumbled upon it. 2 people could have picked up a phone. 2 people could have given investigators a chance to identify her. Instead, they walked away. Whether the story was true or not, that's the part that has never left me. Not the horror, not the mystery, the missed chance. Because sometimes the saddest part of a tragedy isn't what happened. It's knowing that someone might have been able to help and chose not to. And if there really was a woman in that abandoned farmhouse, I hope that eventually someone else found her. I hope her family got answers. I hope her name was finally spoken again. And I hope she eventually received the peace that she was denied for so long. I've rewritten it in the same style you've requested. Simple English, Smooth flow, expanded storytelling, no headings, no bold text, and staying close to the original story. One of the strangest things about growing up is realizing that some events shape you long before you fully understand them. As a child, there are moments that seem important, but confusing. You remember pieces of them. Sounds, images, conversations, feelings. Then, years later, after learning more about what was actually happening, those memories take on a completely different meaning. One of those moments happened when I was young. My mother served on the jury for a murder case that became well known in our area. At the time, I didn't understand what a jury really did. I only knew that my mom disappeared for long periods during the day and wasn't allowed to talk about certain things. As a kid, I thought it was just another adult responsibility, something boring, something unrelated to me. I couldn't have been more wrong. I still remember the day they found the body. Not because I saw anything directly. I didn't. What I remember is being in the car. We were driving when suddenly it felt like every emergency vehicle in the county had come to life. Sirens started appearing from every direction. Police cars, fire trucks, ambulances, vehicle after vehicle racing down the highway. The noise was overwhelming. I had never heard so many sirens at once in my life. As a child, that alone was enough to get my attention. Something serious had happened. Even though nobody explained the details, you could feel it. Adults had a certain look on their faces. The atmosphere changed. People became quieter. Conversations became shorter. Something bad had happened. I just didn't know how bad. The truth came slowly over the following years. Not all at once. Little pieces here and there. Things my mother mentioned after the trial was over. Things I overheard. Things I learned as I got older and became capable of understanding what the case had actually involved. And honestly, I sometimes wish I hadn't learned as much as I did. Because the details were far more disturbing than anything my childhood imagination could have created. When people think about fear, they often think about horror movies. Monsters, ghosts, aliens, demons, creatures hiding in the dark. As a kid, those things scared me too, at least for a while. But learning about that case changed something. The older I got, the more I realized that none of those fictional things bothered me anymore. Horror movies stopped being scary. Not because I became brave, not because I enjoyed scary movies, but because I had learned something much more unsettling. The worst things don't come from monsters. They come from people. No vampire, no zombie, no alien invasion, just ordinary human beings capable of doing terrible things. Once that realization settles into your mind, fictional horror starts to feel different. You watch a movie about a haunted house and think, that isn't real. You watch a movie about some ancient curse and think, that would never happen. But stories about real people, those stay with you because they can happen, and sometimes they do. The case affected me in another way, too, a way I didn't fully recognize until years later. One of the details that stuck with me involved the person connected to the crime. Before everything happened, he had worked with children. Specifically, he had worked at the Boys and Girls Club in South Lake Tahoe. When I first learned that, it hit me harder than any of the other details. Not because it was evidence of wrongdoing in that position. Not because every child care worker should be viewed with suspicion. Far from it. Most people who work with children are wonderful people, dedicated people, caring people, people who genuinely want to help kids. Logically, I know that. I've always known that. But childhood fears don't always listen to logic. When you're a preteen and you learn that someone capable of terrible violence once worked around children, your brain starts making connections. It starts asking uncomfortable questions. How do you know who someone really is? How do you know what's happening inside another person's head? How can someone appear normal while hiding something darker underneath? Those questions settled somewhere in the back of my mind, and they never fully left. As I got older, I noticed that I became unusually anxious about childcare situations. Not because of any specific incident, not because anything bad happened to me personally, but because that case had planted a seed of doubt. A fear that appearances can be deceiving. A fear that bad people don't always look dangerous. They don't wear signs. They don't announce themselves. Sometimes they look like everyone else. That's a difficult lesson to learn at a young age, especially when it comes from a real case instead of a fictional story. Years later, I can still trace some of that anxiety back to those conversations with my mom. I remember hearing pieces of testimony, hearing about evidence, hearing about details that no child should probably spend too much time thinking about. And every time I learned something new, the case felt a little more real, a little closer, a little harder to forget. What fascinates me now is how differently children process information. At the time, I didn't fully understand what I was hearing. I couldn't grasp the legal aspects. I couldn't appreciate the complexity of the investigation. What I absorbed instead was the emotional side, the fear, the sadness, the realization that the world wasn't always safe. As adults, we often assume children don't notice things. But they do. They may not understand everything. They may misunderstand half of it. But they notice far more than we think. I noticed the sirens. I noticed the way adults talked differently afterward. I noticed how serious my mother became whenever the case was mentioned. And over time, those observations became part of my understanding of the world. Even now, years later, I still think about that day occasionally. Not the crime itself, not even the trial. What I remember most is sitting in that car as sirens raced past in every direction. At the time, it felt like an unusual event. Something exciting, something worth looking at through the window. I had no idea those sirens were responding to something that would stay with me for years. I had no idea that one day I would learn what they had been rushing toward. And I certainly had no idea that the case would quietly shape the way I viewed fear, trust, and human nature. People often talk about defining moments as if they happen instantly. A single event, a single decision, a single realization. But sometimes they happen slowly. Sometimes a memory grows heavier as you get older. Sometimes you understand more every year. And sometimes a sound you heard as a child, dozens of sirens echoing down a highway, ends up meaning far more than you ever imagined. For me, that was one of those moments. A moment I didn't understand at the time. A moment I can never completely forget now. And a reminder that the things that truly scare us usually aren't found in horror movies. They're found in real life, carried out by real people, leaving behind consequences that ripple through communities for years afterward. About 2 years ago, I attended a family reunion that was held a couple of hours away from where I lived. It had been a great day overall. I got to catch up with relatives I hadn't seen in a long time, share stories, eat way too much food, and enjoy the kind of atmosphere that only family gatherings can create. The plan had originally been for me to stay the night, but I had an early shift at work the next morning and needed to be back home. As much as I would have preferred to stay, I didn't really have a choice. By the time I left, it was already late. Most of my family tried convincing me to spend the night and leave in the morning, but I assured them I would be fine. The drive was only about 2 hours, and I had made longer trips before without any problems. At least that was what I thought. The first part of the drive was uneventful. The roads were quiet, but not completely empty. Every few minutes, I would see another vehicle heading in either direction. The route took me through a long stretch of countryside where dense trees and thick bushes lined both sides of the road. It was the kind of road you often see in horror movies, where the forest seems endless and there are very few signs of civilization. During the day, it probably would have looked beautiful. At night, it felt completely different. The darkness beyond the headlights was almost solid. My beams illuminated only a small section of road ahead, while everything else disappeared into blackness. Every now and then, the branches of the trees would sway in the wind, creating strange shadows that seemed to move just beyond my vision. For the first 45 minutes, everything was fine. Then, almost without warning, exhaustion hit me. It wasn't the gradual kind of tiredness that builds up over time. It was sudden and overwhelming. One moment, I felt perfectly capable of finishing the drive, and the next, I felt like I could barely keep my eyes open. Anyone who has experienced that kind of fatigue knows exactly what I mean. My eyelids felt heavy. My focus started drifting. I found myself blinking more often and shifting in my seat to stay alert. I rolled down the window to let cold air hit my face. It helped for about 30 seconds. I turned the music up louder. That worked for maybe a minute. I tried talking to myself. I even started recounting random memories out loud just to keep my brain active. Nothing seemed to help. I knew I was reaching the point where continuing to drive was becoming dangerous. Falling asleep behind the wheel wasn't an option. The problem was that there was nowhere obvious to stop. The road stretched endlessly through the forest. There were no gas stations, no rest stops, no parking lots, and no well-lit areas where I felt comfortable pulling over. I kept telling myself that I would find somewhere suitable soon. 5 minutes passed. Then, 10. Still nothing. The tiredness only grew worse. Eventually, I made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time, but was probably one of the dumbest choices I've ever made. I spotted a gap in the bushes along the side of the road and pulled onto the grass. My car disappeared partially behind the vegetation, hidden from easy view unless someone knew exactly where to look. I remember thinking that it was actually a pretty good hiding spot. My logic was simple. If I slept there for 30 or 40 minutes, I could recharge enough to finish the drive safely. I glanced at the dashboard clock before leaning my seat back. 11:22 p.m. I made a mental note of the time. Then I closed my eyes. I don't remember falling asleep. 1 second, I was staring at the roof of my car, and the next, I was waking up. A strange scratching sound had pulled me from sleep. For several seconds, I sat there, confused and disoriented. The sound lasted only briefly before stopping. I looked at the clock. 11:50 p.m. Almost half an hour had passed. I listened carefully. Nothing. The forest was silent. I considered looking outside, but felt too tired to care. In my half-asleep state, I assumed it was probably an animal brushing against the car or moving through the bushes nearby. Without giving it much thought, I closed my eyes again. Sleep returned almost immediately. The next time I woke up was very different. The same scratching sound was there again. Only this time, it didn't stop. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The noise continued. Scratch, 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 slow, deliberate, constant. My eyes snapped open. For a moment, I lay perfectly still, listening. The sound seemed to be coming from somewhere outside the vehicle. I checked the clock. 12:40 a.m. Nearly an hour had passed since the first disturbance. That was when I started feeling genuinely uneasy. If it had been an animal, why had it come back after such a long gap? The thought immediately entered my mind. Maybe it wasn't an animal. I tried convincing myself otherwise. Maybe it was a raccoon, maybe a deer, maybe a branch moving in the wind. But none of those explanations felt right. The scratching continued. My heart began beating faster. Slowly, I lifted my head and looked into the rearview mirror. At first, I saw nothing. Then, movement. Just for a split second, something darted away from the back of my vehicle and disappeared into the darkness of the forest. The glimpse was brief, too brief to identify what I had seen. But it definitely wasn't a deer. At least it didn't look like one. The shape seemed human. Every scary story I had ever heard immediately flooded into my brain. You know how your mind automatically jumps to the worst possible conclusion when you're frightened? That's exactly what happened. I remembered the old urban legend about the killer with the hook. The story where a strange scratching noise comes from outside a parked vehicle, and anyone foolish enough to investigate ends up dead. Was that realistic? Probably not. Did it matter in that moment? Absolutely not. Fear doesn't care about logic. All I knew was that something had been outside my car, and I had no interest in finding out what it was. I decided right then that my nap was over. I started the engine immediately. The sound disappeared. I didn't waste any time. I put the car into gear and pulled back onto the road. As soon as I started driving, I felt a huge wave of relief. The moving vehicle gave me a sense of safety. Whatever had been outside was now behind me. Or so I thought. There was a bend in the road less than 100 yards ahead. As I rounded the corner, my headlights illuminated something that made my stomach drop. Another car. It was parked on the side of the road. The driver's door was wide open. The vehicle looked completely abandoned. I instinctively slowed down, not because I wanted to stop, but because the sight was so unexpected. The road had been mostly empty all night. Now there was a random vehicle sitting in the darkness, with nobody visible nearby. As I passed, I glanced inside. No driver, no passengers, nothing. The interior appeared empty. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it somehow made the situation feel even worse. Who leaves a car in the middle of nowhere with the door open? As my vehicle moved past, I checked the rearview mirror. The road behind me looked empty. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the scratching noise really had been an animal. Maybe exhaustion had made me paranoid. Then, everything changed. Out of nowhere, a man came sprinting around the bend. 1 second, there was nobody there. The next second, he was running directly down the road. Even from a distance, I could tell he was moving fast. Very fast. He wasn't waving for help. He wasn't signaling that he was stranded. He wasn't acting like someone with car trouble. He was charging toward my vehicle. Then he started screaming. At first, I couldn't understand what he was saying. The words were swallowed by distance and adrenaline. As he got closer, his voice became clearer. Hey, you, get out of your car. Now. The sound of his voice sent a chill through me. There was something aggressive about the way he shouted. Something desperate. Something wrong. I remember staring into the mirror, completely frozen for a second. My brain was trying to process what was happening. Why would anyone want me to get out of my car in the middle of nowhere after midnight? Why was he running after me? Why had he been hiding near that abandoned vehicle? Every instinct I had screamed the same answer. Leave immediately. I didn't hesitate. I pressed the accelerator and sped away. The engine roared as the car surged forward. I kept checking my mirrors. For a few moments, I could still see him running. Then he became smaller. Then he disappeared completely into the darkness. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The rest of the drive home felt endless. Every set of headlights behind me made me nervous. Every vehicle I passed made me wonder if it somehow involved the man from the road. My imagination ran wild. Had he been trying to rob me? Had he been mentally unstable? Had he simply needed help and panicked when he saw me leaving? To this day, I have no idea. The truth is that I'll probably never know. What I do know is that something about that entire situation felt wrong. The scratching noises, the hidden figure near my car, the abandoned vehicle, the man sprinting down the road screaming for me to get out. None of it made sense. When I finally reached home, I locked my doors and barely slept for the remainder of the night. Even now, years later, I still think about that experience from time to time. The memory remains surprisingly vivid. I can still picture the dark road disappearing between the trees. I can still remember waking up to that strange scratching sound. I can still see that man running toward me in the rearview mirror. Maybe there was a completely innocent explanation for everything that happened. Maybe there wasn't. Either way, I learned an important lesson that night. If you're exhausted while driving, find a safe and legitimate place to rest. A gas station, a rest area, a motel, anywhere designed for travelers. Because pulling over on a deserted road in the middle of nowhere might seem harmless at the time. But sometimes, when you're alone in the dark and surrounded by miles of empty forest, you have no idea who or what might be watching from just beyond the trees. A few years ago, I decided to go for a walk through a wooded area not far from where I lived. It was one of those places where very few people ever went. There were no proper trails, no signs, and no reason for anyone to be there unless they were deliberately trying to get away from the world for a while. I enjoyed exploring places like that. There was something peaceful about being surrounded by trees with nothing but the sound of the wind and birds in the distance. The weather that day was pleasant enough, and I had no particular destination in mind. I was simply wandering through the woods, taking my time and enjoying the quiet. The deeper I went, the more isolated the area became. The ground was uneven, covered with fallen branches and thick undergrowth. Every now and then I would have to push my way through bushes or step over fallen logs. At first, everything seemed completely normal. Then I noticed a strange smell. It was faint at the beginning, just enough to catch my attention. I assumed it might be a dead animal somewhere nearby. That's not unusual in the countryside. Animals die in the woods all the time, and sooner or later, nature takes care of them. I didn't think much of it and continued walking. As I moved forward, however, the smell became stronger. Within a few minutes, it was impossible to ignore. It was an incredibly sweet odor, but not in a pleasant way. It was thick and overwhelming, hanging heavily in the air. The closer I got, the more intense it became. I remember stopping and looking around, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Most people would probably have turned around and left, but I've always been curious. That curiosity has gotten me into trouble more than once. Instead of walking away, I started following the smell. The undergrowth in that part of the woods was dense. I had to push aside branches and bushes as I made my way toward the source. The smell grew stronger with every step. Eventually, I reached a patch of thick vegetation that seemed to be hiding something behind it. I pulled the branches aside and looked through. What I saw froze me in place. There was a body lying on the ground. For a few seconds, my brain struggled to process what I was looking at. It didn't seem real. You don't expect to find something like that during a casual walk in the woods. The man had clearly been there for quite some time. The effects of decomposition were impossible to ignore. His body was swollen and discolored. Large areas of his skin had turned dark shades of green and black. Nature had already begun reclaiming him. Insects were everywhere, and it was obvious that local wildlife had discovered him long before I had. The sight was horrifying. I had never seen a dead body before. At least not like that. Television and movies don't prepare you for the reality. The smell, the appearance, the silence surrounding it, it was all far worse than anything I could have imagined. I stumbled backward and nearly fell over. My heart was racing so hard that I could feel it pounding in my chest. For several moments, I simply stood there staring, unable to think clearly. Once the initial shock wore off, I knew I had to call the police. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone. Thankfully, I managed to get a signal. I explained what I had found and gave them the best description of my location that I could. The operator asked several questions and told me officers were on their way. Then came the part that made the whole situation even worse. The police asked me to remain where I was until they arrived. Apparently, because I had discovered the body, they wanted someone at the scene. They didn't want the location disturbed before investigators could examine it properly. At the time, I understood the reasoning. That didn't make it any easier. The area was extremely remote, and it was going to take them quite a while to reach me. So there I was, stuck in the middle of nowhere with a dead body only a short distance away. I tried not to look in that direction. Instead, I found a spot nearby and sat down to wait. The first half hour wasn't too bad. I was mostly occupied with trying to calm myself down. I kept checking my phone, checking the time, and listening for approaching vehicles or voices. Nothing. The woods remained completely silent. As more time passed, the reality of my situation started to sink in. I was alone in an isolated forest with a dead man lying nearby. The smell drifted through the air every now and then whenever the wind changed direction. I found myself imagining who he had been. Had he been missing? Did his family know where he was? How long had he been there? Had anyone been looking for him? The longer I sat there, the more questions entered my mind. Eventually, the sun began to set. That was when things became truly uncomfortable. Daylight slowly faded from the woods. Shadows stretched between the trees until everything seemed darker and more threatening. Familiar shapes became strange and unsettling. Every sound suddenly felt amplified. A snapping branch somewhere in the distance would make me jump. Rustling leaves sounded like footsteps. The occasional cry of a bird seemed unnaturally loud. I knew there was nothing supernatural happening. At least that's what I kept telling myself. But fear has a way of playing tricks on your mind. As darkness settled over the forest, I became increasingly aware of the body's presence. Even when I wasn't looking toward it, I knew exactly where it was. It felt impossible to forget. Hours seemed to pass. I sat there in the dark, waiting for flashing lights to appear through the trees. The entire experience felt surreal. Eventually, the police arrived. I don't think I've ever been so relieved to see another human being. They secured the area, took my statement, and began their investigation. After answering their questions, I was finally allowed to leave. I went home exhausted. For several days afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. Every time I closed my eyes, the image returned. The smell was somehow even worse than the visual memory. It seemed permanently burned into my brain. Certain scents would trigger memories of that day, bringing everything rushing back. A short time later, I learned that the man had taken his own life. Hearing that made the situation even sadder. Finding a body is disturbing enough, but knowing the circumstances behind it added another layer of tragedy. This had been a real person with a life, struggles, and a story that had ended alone in the woods. I thought that understanding what happened might help me move on. Instead, something unexpected began happening. I started dreaming about him. At first, the dreams were relatively simple. I would find myself back in the forest, walking the same path I had taken that day. Everything would appear exactly as I remembered it. Then I would smell that familiar, sweet odor. No matter which direction I ran, I would eventually find myself standing in front of the same patch of undergrowth, the same place, the same body. The dreams became more frequent over time. Eventually, he started speaking. In the dreams, he never looked the way he probably had in life. He always appeared exactly as I found him, decayed, motionless at first, and then suddenly aware. He would open his eyes and stare directly at me. The things he said were never pleasant. Again, I know dreams come from our own minds. Rationally, I understand that. But when you're asleep and trapped inside a nightmare, logic doesn't always help. He would tell me that I should have left him alone. He would accuse me of disturbing his resting place. Sometimes he seemed angry. Other times he seemed disappointed. The worst dreams were the ones where he tried convincing me to join him. He would tell me that I didn't belong among the living. He would describe death as peaceful and inevitable. His voice was always calm, which somehow made it more disturbing. I would wake up drenched in sweat with my heart racing. For a long time, these nightmares happened regularly. I became reluctant to talk about what I had experienced because every conversation seemed to bring the memories back. Friends and family were sympathetic, but unless you've gone through something similar, it's difficult to understand how deeply an event like that can affect you. People often assume that fear disappears once the danger is gone. That's not always true. Sometimes the real impact arrives later, after you've had time to process what happened. Months passed. The nightmares gradually became less frequent, but they never completely disappeared. Just when I thought I was finally over it, another dream would arrive. I would find myself back in those woods again, back in the darkness, back near that hidden clearing where I made a discovery I never wanted to make. Even now, years later, the memory remains vivid. I can still remember the smell. I can still remember the silence. I can still remember sitting alone in the growing darkness, waiting for help to arrive. Most of all, I remember the strange feeling that stayed with me afterward. It wasn't just fear. It was the unsettling realization that an ordinary day can suddenly become something you'll carry with you for the rest of your life. The dreams are much rarer now, but they still happen occasionally. Every few months, sometimes longer, I'll see him again. The setting never changes. The woods are always quiet. The air always carries that same sweet smell. And somewhere among the trees, he is waiting. Whenever he appears, I wake up feeling unsettled for the rest of the day. Even after all these years, a part of me still remembers that evening in perfect detail. In the end, I know the dreams are probably nothing more than my mind trying to make sense of a traumatic experience. Finding a body isn't something most people are prepared for, and perhaps some memories never fully fade. Still, every time I tell this story, I can't help wondering if he'll show up again that night. And if I'm being honest, after writing all of this down, there's a good chance I'll be walking through those woods again in my sleep before morning. This happened when I was much younger, and even now it's one of the strangest things that has ever happened to me. It isn't the most dramatic or terrifying story in the world, but what makes it unsettling is that to this day, nobody has been able to explain it. I was just a kid at the time and living with my parents. It was a completely normal night as far as I can remember. There was nothing unusual about the day leading up to it. I went through my normal routine, got ready for bed, and went to sleep without thinking twice about anything. At some point during the night, something happened. The problem is that I have absolutely no memory of it. I don't remember waking up. I don't remember hearing a noise. I don't remember falling out of bed or bumping into anything. As far as I know, I slept through the entire thing. The first thing I remember is waking up sometime in the middle of the night with a strange sensation on my face. At first I was confused. I wasn't in pain. Nothing hurt. I hadn't been startled awake by a loud noise or a bad dream. I simply became aware that one side of my face felt wet. Still half asleep, I reached up and touched my cheek. When I pulled my hand away, it was covered in blood. For a second, my sleepy brain couldn't process what I was seeing. I just stared at my hand. Then I touched my face again. More blood. A lot more. By that point, I was fully awake. Blood was running down the side of my face and dripping onto my shirt. It wasn't a small cut or a little scratch. The blood was flowing heavily enough that it immediately scared me. I jumped out of bed and rushed out of my room. Even though I was young, I knew something wasn't right. I made my way down the hallway and into my parents' room. I remember standing there in the doorway trying to explain what was happening. The moment they turned on the light and looked at me, their reactions told me everything I needed to know. They were horrified. My mom immediately jumped out of bed. My dad was asking questions faster than I could answer them. Where did you get hurt? What happened? Did you fall? Did something hit you? I couldn't answer any of it. I had no idea. All I knew was that I had gone to bed completely fine and somehow woke up covered in blood. The cut was located next to my eye, not directly on it, thankfully, but close enough to make everyone nervous. The blood made it look much worse than it probably was, but it was still serious enough that my parents knew I needed medical attention. Before leaving the house, they tried figuring out what had happened. The assumption was that I must have cut myself on something while sleeping. Maybe there was a sharp object in the bed. Maybe something had broken. Maybe part of the bed frame had a jagged edge. At the time, all of those explanations seemed reasonable. The problem was that none of them turned out to be true. After checking the injury and making sure I was okay, my parents started searching my room. They looked everywhere. The sheets, the blanket, the pillow, the pillowcase, the mattress, the headboard, the bed frame, the floor, every possible surface near where I had been sleeping. Nothing. There was no broken object, no exposed nail, no sharp metal, no piece of glass, no damaged furniture. Nothing that could explain a cut severe enough to require medical treatment. Meanwhile, the bleeding continued. Eventually, my parents stopped searching and focused on getting me to the hospital. I remember sitting in the car feeling completely confused. The adrenaline had started wearing off by then, and the reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. I kept trying to remember if anything unusual had happened before I went to sleep. Maybe I had bumped my head earlier in the day. Maybe I had scratched myself somehow. Maybe there was something I wasn't remembering. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't think of anything. At the hospital, the doctors cleaned the wound and examined it carefully. The cut wasn't huge, but it was deep enough that stitches were necessary. In the end, I needed 8 stitches next to my eye. 8. That's a lot more than you would expect from a minor scratch. The doctor asked the same questions everyone else had been asking. How did it happen? What caused it? Did I hit something? Did I fall? Again, nobody had an answer. My parents explained the situation exactly as it had happened. I went to sleep. I woke up bleeding. Nobody knew why. Even the medical staff seemed puzzled. Not necessarily because the injury was unusual, but because there was no obvious explanation for it. Normally, when someone shows up with a facial laceration, there is a story attached to it. A fall, an accident, a sports injury, a collision. something. In my case, there was nothing. Just a wound that seemed to appear out of nowhere. After I received the stitches, we returned home. The following day, the investigation continued. At least that's what my parents jokingly called it. The mystery of what cut my face. They searched the room again in daylight. This time, they were even more thorough. Every inch of the bed was inspected. The mattress was removed. The sheets were checked carefully. The frame was examined from top to bottom. Nothing. There wasn't a single object that looked capable of causing the injury. The stranger part was the location of the cut. It wasn't on an area of my face that would normally scrape against the bed while sleeping. The wound sat dangerously close to my eye. If whatever caused it had been even slightly closer, the outcome could have been much worse. That realization made the entire situation even more unsettling. As the days passed, the cut slowly healed. The stitches eventually came out. Life returned to normal. But the questions never went away. Every once in a while, the topic would come up again during family conversations. Someone would mention it, and the discussion would immediately restart. What actually happened that night? Everyone would offer theories. Maybe I scratched myself while sleeping. But if that were true, why was the cut so deep? Maybe there was something sharp hidden in the bed, but nothing was ever found. Maybe I hit my face against something. What exactly? There wasn't anything nearby. Every explanation seemed to create more questions than answers. Years passed. The scar faded considerably, although if you know where to look, it's still there. The mystery, however, remained. Even now, when I think back on it, I can still remember the feeling of touching my cheek and seeing blood on my hand. I can still remember walking into my parents' room and watching their expressions change the moment they saw me. I can still remember everyone searching the bedroom for answers. And I can still remember how nobody found any. The logical side of me knows there was probably an explanation. There almost certainly was. Accidents happen. People get injured in strange ways all the time. The human body can move in unexpected ways during sleep. Somewhere, somehow, there was likely a perfectly ordinary reason for what happened. But the fact that nobody ever figured it out is what makes the memory stick with me. Most childhood injuries come with a story. You fell off a bike. You slipped on a playground. You ran into a wall. Years later, you can point to the scar and explain exactly where it came from. This scar is different. Whenever someone asks about it, all I can say is that I went to bed one night, completely fine, and woke up with blood running down my face. The injury was serious enough to require 8 stitches. My parents searched everywhere for an answer. The doctors couldn't explain it. Nothing sharp was ever found. And after all these years, none of us have the slightest idea what actually cut my face. Maybe there's a simple explanation that we somehow missed. Maybe the answer was right in front of us the entire time. Or maybe it's one of those strange mysteries that never gets solved. Either way, it's been years, and to this day, whenever the story comes up, the conversation always ends the same way. A room full of people looking at each other and saying exactly the same thing. What on earth could have caused that? One of the strangest experiences I've ever had happened while I was asleep. It wasn't a ghost story or anything supernatural, but it scared me more than a lot of things that have happened while I was actually awake. It happened in the middle of an ordinary night. I had gone to bed at a reasonable time and fallen asleep without any problems. As far as I can remember, nothing unusual had happened that day. There was no reason for me to feel anxious or on edge before going to sleep. At some point during the night, I started having a dream. At first, it seemed completely normal by dream standards. You know the kind of dream where everything feels perfectly logical while you're in it, even though none of it makes any sense when you wake up. I don't remember every detail now, but I remember there were several people in the dream. Everyone was doing their own thing, and I was simply following along as events unfolded. Nothing about it felt scary. Nothing felt threatening. It was just another random dream that my brain had decided to create. One particular woman stood out among the other characters. She wasn't someone I recognized from real life. She wasn't a celebrity, a family member, or anyone I had ever met before. She was simply one of those completely fictional people that seemed to exist only inside dreams. For most of the dream, she behaved like every other dream character. She talked to other people. She moved around. She interacted with the environment. Everything seemed normal. Then something happened that instantly changed the entire mood of the dream. Without warning, she stopped what she was doing. She slowly turned her head and looked directly at me. Not at the version of me inside the dream, at me. That's the only way I can describe it. Suddenly, it felt less like she was a character in the dream and more like she was aware that I was dreaming. The shift was immediate and incredibly unsettling. Up until that moment, she had been acting like a normal person within the dream story. Then all at once, it felt like she had stepped outside the dream and was addressing me personally. The expression on her face changed completely. She looked serious, not scared, not angry, just intensely serious. The kind of expression someone has when they're about to tell you something important, something urgent, something you need to hear right now. The entire dream seemed to pause around her. Everything else faded into the background. Then she spoke. In a calm but firm voice, she said, "There's someone in your apartment. Wake up." That was it. No explanation, no warning, no additional details. Just those words. "There's someone in your apartment. Wake up." Second she said it, pure panic exploded through my body. I woke up instantly. Not gradually. Not the usual sleepy process where you slowly become aware of your surroundings. I mean instantly. One moment I was dreaming. The next, I was sitting upright in bed with my heart trying to punch its way out of my chest. For a few seconds, I couldn't even breathe properly. The dream had felt so real that my brain accepted the warning before logic had a chance to catch up. Every survival instinct I had suddenly activated at once. My apartment was dark, silent, still. But all I could think about was that sentence. "There's someone in your apartment." I sat there listening. Every tiny noise suddenly seemed suspicious. The hum of an appliance, the creaking of the building settling, the distant sound of traffic outside. Each one felt like potential evidence that someone might actually be inside. My eyes darted around the room. Every shadow looked threatening. Every dark corner suddenly seemed capable of hiding a person. The strange thing about fear is that it doesn't always care whether something is rational. Part of me knew the warning had come from a dream, a completely fictional dream. A dream character had essentially told me to wake up. That should have been enough to dismiss it. Instead, my brain treated the information as if it had come from a trusted source. After all, if a random dream character suddenly breaks from the script, stares directly at you, and urgently tells you to wake up, it's surprisingly difficult to ignore. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. Everything looked normal. No missed calls, no notifications, nothing unusual. That should have reassured me. It didn't. I continued listening, waiting, expecting to hear footsteps, a door opening, movement somewhere in the apartment, anything. But there was nothing. The silence only made me more nervous. Eventually, I forced myself to get out of bed. That was probably the hardest part. As long as I remained in bed, I could pretend there might not be anything there. The moment I started checking the apartment, I was either going to confirm my fear or prove it wrong. Neither option felt appealing at the time. Still, I couldn't just sit there forever, so I got up, slowly, carefully. My heart was still racing. I checked the bedroom first. Nothing. Then the hallway. Nothing. The bathroom. Empty. The kitchen. Empty. The living room. Empty. Every room was exactly as I had left it before going to sleep. No intruders. No signs of forced entry. No open windows. No unlocked doors. Nothing. The apartment was completely empty. Logically, that should have been the end of the story. Problem solved. False alarm. Back to bed. Except the feeling didn't disappear immediately. Even after confirming that I was alone, I couldn't shake the weirdness of what had happened. What stuck with me wasn't the fear itself. It was the way the dream had changed. Dream characters don't normally do that. At least not in my experience. Usually they're just part of the dream. They follow whatever strange storyline your brain has created. This felt different. It felt like someone had hit pause on the dream and delivered a message directly to me. I know that sounds ridiculous. I know there was almost certainly a perfectly normal explanation. Dreams are weird. Brains are weird. Sometimes our minds create situations that feel far more significant than they actually are. But in that moment, it genuinely felt like that woman had become aware of me, like she had stopped being a character and become a messenger. The fact that her message was specifically about waking up made it even stranger. If she had said something random, I probably would have forgotten about it. But telling me there was someone in my apartment, that was enough to trigger every fear response imaginable. Looking back on it now, I can laugh about it. At the time, though, I was convinced I was about to discover a burglar standing in my kitchen. Instead, I spent the next half hour sitting awake in bed, replaying the dream over and over again. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. I couldn't remember anything else she had said during the dream. I couldn't remember her name. I couldn't even clearly remember what she looked like anymore. The only thing that remained crystal clear was the moment she turned toward me and delivered that warning. Years later, that's still the part I remember. Not because there was actually someone in the apartment. There wasn't. Not because anything supernatural happened. As far as I know, nothing did. It's memorable because of how completely convinced I was for those first few seconds after waking up. My rational mind never stood a chance. A woman who existed only inside a dream looked me directly in the eye and told me there was someone in my home. And for one terrifying moment, I believed her completely. Even now, if a dream character suddenly stopped what they were doing, stared directly at me and said, "Wake up. There's someone in your apartment," I'd probably have the exact same reaction. I'd wake up in a panic, check every room, and spend the rest of the night wondering why my own subconscious decided to terrorize me. One of the strangest memories from my childhood is something that, on the surface, sounds relatively simple. Nothing dramatic happened afterward. Nobody was hurt. There was no explanation, no confrontation, and no real conclusion. That's exactly what makes it unsettling. To this day, I still have no idea who the man was or why he did what he did. I was very young when it happened, probably around 6 years old. My younger brother was even younger, maybe 4 at the time. We lived in a fairly quiet area where not many people came and went. Our house sat back from the road, and the driveway was long enough that you couldn't easily see the house from the street. Because of that, random visitors were uncommon. Anyone who came up the driveway usually had a reason to be there. Family members, friends, neighbors. delivery drivers, people we recognized. Strangers almost never appeared. It was winter when this happened. One of those days where fresh snow covered everything and turned the entire neighborhood into a giant playground. For kids, snow days felt magical. The world looked different. Everything seemed brighter and quieter at the same time. My brother and I had spent most of the day outside playing, building forts, throwing snowballs, making tracks through untouched patches of snow, the kind of things kids do when they don't have a single responsibility in the world. I remember being completely absorbed in whatever game we were playing. At that age, nothing existed beyond the next few minutes. The future didn't matter. The past didn't matter. The entire world was simply snow, laughter, and imagination. At some point during the afternoon, we noticed a vehicle turning into the driveway. Even as children, we immediately recognized that something was unusual. The vehicle was a white car. Nothing especially memorable about it beyond that. What stood out was the fact that we didn't recognize it. The car slowly made its way up the driveway toward us. At first, I assumed it was someone looking for directions or perhaps a visitor who had come to see my parents. The car continued approaching. My brother and I stopped what we were doing and watched. The vehicle eventually slowed down near where we were standing. Then it came to a stop. For a moment, nothing happened. The engine remained running. The driver stayed inside. Neither of us felt scared at first, just curious. Then the driver's window rolled down. A man was sitting behind the wheel. Even after all these years, I still remember certain details about his appearance. He had short hair, he had a goatee. Beyond that, my memory becomes less reliable. Time has a way of blurring details, but those features remained stuck in my mind for some reason. The man looked directly at us. Neither my brother nor I said anything. Neither did he. There was no greeting, no smile, no introduction, no explanation for why he was there. Instead, he reached for something. At first, I didn't understand what it was. Then I realized he was holding a camera, not a phone camera. This happened long before everyone carried cameras in their pockets. This was an actual camera, the kind people intentionally brought with them when they wanted photographs. The man raised it toward us and took our picture. Just like that. No warning, no permission, no conversation. A complete stranger drove up our hidden driveway, rolled down his window, pointed a camera at two small children, and snapped a photograph. I remember feeling confused more than anything else. At 6 years old, I didn't fully understand why that was strange. Adults took pictures all the time. Parents took pictures. Relatives took pictures. Teachers took pictures during school events. Photographs seemed normal. The only unusual part was that we had never seen this man before. The moment the picture was taken, he lowered the camera. For a second, I expected him to explain himself. Maybe tell us who he was. Maybe ask where our parents were. Maybe say he had mistaken us for someone else. Instead, he simply rolled the window back up. The entire interaction lasted less than a minute. Then he drove away, just turned around and left. No explanation, no wave, nothing. My brother and I stood there watching the car disappear down the driveway. Neither of us really knew what to make of it. Kids are strange in that way. Something can be incredibly unusual, and yet they'll often accept it without questioning it too much. I don't remember feeling afraid, at least not immediately. Mostly, I remember feeling puzzled. Eventually, we went inside and told our mother what had happened. The reaction was immediate. The second she heard the story, her expression changed. Unlike us, she understood exactly how strange the situation was. I still remember the concern on her face. She started asking questions right away. What did the man look like? What kind of car was it? What did he say? Did he get out? Did he ask your names? The problem was that we didn't have many answers. The entire encounter had happened so quickly. All we could tell her was that a man drove up, took our picture, and left. That was it. As adults, it's easy to understand why that would be alarming, especially for a parent. The house wasn't visible from the road. The driveway wasn't a place people accidentally wandered into. Someone had deliberately driven onto the property. Someone had specifically stopped where two young children were playing. And then, for reasons nobody understood, taken a photograph before leaving. The more you think about it, the stranger it becomes. My mother was deeply unsettled by the whole thing. I don't remember every detail of what happened afterward. I know she kept an eye out for the vehicle for a while. I know she talked about it repeatedly in the days that followed. But as far as I know, the man never came back. No one ever contacted us. No photographs ever surfaced. No explanation was ever provided. The entire incident simply ended as suddenly as it had begun. Years passed. Life moved on. My brother and I grew older. The strange man in the white car became one of those stories that occasionally resurfaced during family conversations. Whenever it came up, everyone had the same reaction. Confusion. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody knew what he wanted. Nobody knew why he took the picture. Over time, countless theories emerged. Maybe he was a photographer who liked capturing winter scenes. Maybe he thought we were someone else's children. Maybe he was lost. Maybe he was documenting rural neighborhoods. Maybe there was a completely innocent explanation. The problem is that every theory raises another question. If it was innocent, why didn't he simply say something? Why not introduce himself? Why not explain what he was doing? Most people would. Instead, he behaved like someone who wanted the interaction to be as brief as possible. Arrive, take the picture, leave. That's what makes the memory linger. Not because anything terrible happened. Nothing did. Not because there was any evidence of harmful intentions. There wasn't. It's memorable because it remains completely unexplained. Most childhood mysteries eventually receive answers. You learn what happened. You discover the missing details. You realize there was a simple explanation all along. This story never got that ending. Even now, all these years later, I can still picture the snow-covered yard. I can still remember standing beside my younger brother. I can still see the white car slowly making its way up the driveway. And I can still remember the strange man with short hair and a goatee lifting the camera toward us. One click, one photograph, then he was gone. Somewhere out there, assuming he's even still alive, there may be a man who once had a random photograph of two children playing in the snow outside a house hidden from the road. Maybe the picture was innocent. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe he forgot about it the very next day. Whatever the truth is, we'll probably never know. And after all these years, that's still the creepiest part. The mystery never ended. It simply drove away. This happened several years ago, and even now it's one of the strangest nights I can remember. I've tried to come up with logical explanations for it over the years, and maybe there is one. Maybe I was half asleep. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me in the dark. Maybe my brain was turning ordinary shadows into something they weren't. But at the time, it felt absolutely real. What made the experience even more unsettling was that I wasn't the only one reacting to whatever was there. My cat noticed it too. At least, that's what it felt like. It happened on a completely ordinary night. I had fallen asleep in the living room for no particular reason. Sometimes it was just more comfortable than going to my bedroom, especially after a long day. The television had been on earlier, but at some point I drifted off and everything went quiet. I don't remember dreaming. I don't remember waking up gradually. Instead, I suddenly became conscious. One moment I was asleep. The next, I was wide awake. Not groggy, not confused, wide awake. The kind of awake where every sense immediately feels alert. For a few seconds, I simply lay there staring into the darkness. At first, I wasn't sure why I had woken up. Then I heard it. A low growling sound. My cat. Anyone who owns cats knows they make all kinds of strange noises. But this wasn't one of them. This wasn't a sleepy complaint or a random sound. This was a warning. The kind of deep, uncomfortable growl that immediately gets your attention. I turned my head toward the noise. My cat was staring across the room, completely focused on something. Its body was tense. Its eyes were locked in one direction. And it was continuing to growl. That alone was enough to make me nervous. Animals notice things we don't all the time. Usually it's harmless. A bug on the wall. A sound outside. A reflection. But when you wake up in the middle of the night and see your pet fixated on something in the darkness, your imagination immediately starts working against you. I followed my cat's gaze. And that's when I saw it. Across the room stood what appeared to be a figure. At first, I couldn't process what I was looking at. The room was dark enough that details were impossible to make out clearly. All I could see was a silhouette. Tall, still, vaguely human-shaped. It wasn't standing close to me. It was positioned across the room, partially swallowed by the darkness. I couldn't see a face. I couldn't see eyes. I couldn't identify any features at all. Yet somehow, I had the overwhelming feeling that it was looking directly at me. That feeling is difficult to explain. There was no evidence for it. No visible eyes, no expression, nothing. And yet I felt absolutely certain that whatever I was looking at was staring back. Every hair on my body stood up. My first instinct was to move, to sit up, to get a better look. Slowly, I pushed myself upright. The figure didn't react. It remained completely motionless. I blinked several times. Still there. I rubbed my eyes. Still there. The shape never changed, never shifted, never moved. My heart was racing. I remember thinking that if it was a person, they would eventually move. They would blink, adjust their posture, take a step, do something. But nothing happened. The room remained completely silent, except for my cat's occasional growl. The figure simply stood there, watching, or at least feeling like it was watching. I leaned forward slightly, trying to make out more details. The darkness refused to cooperate. No matter how hard I looked, the shape remained little more than a black outline. I couldn't tell where its features should have been. I couldn't tell whether it was facing me directly. I couldn't even tell if it was actually human, only that it seemed human-shaped. And somehow, that made it worse. Minutes passed. At least I think they did. Time felt strange. The entire situation felt suspended, as if nothing existed except me, my cat, and that silent shape across the room. Part of me wanted to get up and turn on a light. Another part of me was terrified of moving at all. What if it moved when I moved? What if getting closer made things worse? What if I discovered it wasn't what I thought it was? So I stayed where I was. Watching, waiting, the figure never reacted. Neither of us broke eye contact. Or at least it felt like eye contact. The whole experience had an almost dreamlike quality, not because it felt unreal. Quite the opposite. It felt too real. Every second seemed painfully vivid. I remember noticing how quiet the house was, how loud my breathing sounded, how tense my muscles had become. And through it all, the shape remained exactly where it was. At some point, I realized I had been staring at it for a very long time. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe less, maybe more. It's hard to judge time accurately in moments like that. All I know is that it felt like forever. Then something happened that I still can't explain. Without warning, a feeling washed over me. Peace. Complete and total peace. The fear disappeared. Not gradually. Instantly, one moment I was terrified. The next, I felt perfectly calm. It was such a dramatic change that it almost startled me more than the figure itself. The anxiety vanished. The tension left my body. My racing thoughts stopped. It was as if someone had flipped a switch inside my head. Suddenly, I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't curious anymore. I wasn't even concerned. I simply felt tired, comfortably tired. The figure was still there. At least I think it was. But somehow it no longer seemed important. Looking back, that part feels stranger than anything else. Why would I suddenly become calm after spending so long staring at something that terrified me? Why would my fear disappear so completely? I have no answer. All I know is that I slowly lay back down, pulled the blanket over myself, closed my eyes, and went back to sleep. Not restless sleep, not nervous sleep, normal sleep. The kind you fall into when everything feels safe. The next morning, sunlight filled the room. The events of the night came rushing back immediately. For a moment, I wondered whether I had dreamed the entire thing, but it hadn't felt like a dream, not even close. I got up and walked over to the area where the figure had been standing. I wanted answers. I wanted to find whatever object had created that silhouette. A coat rack, a chair, a stack of boxes, anything, but there was nothing. Nothing that matched the shape I remembered. Nothing tall enough. Nothing positioned correctly. Nothing that should have created the outline I had spent so much time staring at. I checked from different angles, different positions in the room, different lighting conditions. Still nothing. The more I looked, the less sense it made. If it had been a trick of the shadows, I should have been able to recreate it. If it had been furniture, I should have recognized it. But I couldn't. That doesn't mean something supernatural happened. I'm sure there are plenty of reasonable explanations. Sleep paralysis, a hypnopompic hallucination, a combination of darkness and an overactive imagination. Any of those could be true. What I know for certain is how it felt. I know I woke up suddenly. I know my cat was growling at something across the room. I know I saw a shape standing there. And I know that after staring at it for what felt like an eternity, an overwhelming sense of peace convinced me to simply lie back down and go to sleep. To this day, I don't know what I was looking at. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was something. Either way, I haven't slept in the living room since. Some mysteries are easier to leave alone than solve. This happened several years ago, and even now it's one of the strangest nights I can remember. I've tried to come up with logical explanations for it over the years, and maybe there is one. Maybe I was half asleep. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me in the dark. Maybe my brain was turning ordinary shadows into something they weren't. But at the time, it felt absolutely real. What made the experience even more unsettling was that I wasn't the only one reacting to whatever was there. My cat noticed it too. At least, that's what it felt like. It happened on a completely ordinary night. I had fallen asleep in the living room for no particular reason. Sometimes it was just more comfortable than going to my bedroom, especially after a long day. The television had been on earlier, but at some point I drifted off and everything went quiet. I don't remember dreaming. I don't remember waking up gradually. Instead, I suddenly became conscious. One moment I was asleep. The next, I was wide awake. Not groggy, not confused, wide awake. The kind of awake where every sense immediately feels alert. For a few seconds, I simply lay there staring into the darkness. At first, I wasn't sure why I had woken up. Then I heard it. A low growling sound. My cat. Anyone who owns cats knows they make all kinds of strange noises. But this wasn't one of them. This wasn't a sleepy complaint or a random sound. This was a warning. The kind of deep, uncomfortable growl that immediately gets your attention. I turned my head toward the noise. My cat was staring across the room, completely focused on something. Its body was tense. Its eyes were locked in one direction. And it was continuing to growl. That alone was enough to make me nervous. Animals notice things we don't all the time. Usually it's harmless. A bug on the wall. A sound outside. A reflection. But when you wake up in the middle of the night and see your pet fixated on something in the darkness, your imagination immediately starts working against you. I followed my cat's gaze. And that's when I saw it. Across the room stood what appeared to be a figure. At first, I couldn't process what I was looking at. The room was dark enough that details were impossible to make out clearly. All I could see was a silhouette. Tall, still, vaguely human-shaped. It wasn't standing close to me. It was positioned across the room, partially swallowed by the darkness. I couldn't see a face. I couldn't see eyes. I couldn't identify any features at all. Yet somehow, I had the overwhelming feeling that it was looking directly at me. That feeling is difficult to explain. There was no evidence for it. No visible eyes, no expression, nothing. And yet I felt absolutely certain that whatever I was looking at was staring back. Every hair on my body stood up. My first instinct was to move, to sit up, to get a better look. Slowly, I pushed myself upright. The figure didn't react. It remained completely motionless. I blinked several times. Still there. I rubbed my eyes. Still there. The shape never changed, never shifted, never moved. My heart was racing. I remember thinking that if it was a person, they would eventually move. They would blink, adjust their posture, take a step, do something. But nothing happened. The room remained completely silent, except for my cat's occasional growl. The figure simply stood there, watching, or at least feeling like it was watching. I leaned forward slightly, trying to make out more details. The darkness refused to cooperate. No matter how hard I looked, the shape remained little more than a black outline. I couldn't tell where its features should have been. I couldn't tell whether it was facing me directly. I couldn't even tell if it was actually human, only that it seemed human-shaped. And somehow, that made it worse. Minutes passed. At least I think they did. Time felt strange. The entire situation felt suspended, as if nothing existed except me, my cat, and that silent shape across the room. Part of me wanted to get up and turn on a light. Another part of me was terrified of moving at all. What if it moved when I moved? What if getting closer made things worse? What if I discovered it wasn't what I thought it was? So I stayed where I was. Watching, waiting, the figure never reacted. Neither of us broke eye contact. Or at least it felt like eye contact. The whole experience had an almost dreamlike quality, not because it felt unreal. Quite the opposite. It felt too real. Every second seemed painfully vivid. I remember noticing how quiet the house was, how loud my breathing sounded, how tense my muscles had become. And through it all, the shape remained exactly where it was. At some point, I realized I had been staring at it for a very long time. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe less, maybe more. It's hard to judge time accurately in moments like that. All I know is that it felt like forever. Then something happened that I still can't explain. Without warning, a feeling washed over me. Peace. Complete and total peace. The fear disappeared. Not gradually. Instantly, one moment I was terrified. The next, I felt perfectly calm. It was such a dramatic change that it almost startled me more than the figure itself. The anxiety vanished. The tension left my body. My racing thoughts stopped. It was as if someone had flipped a switch inside my head. Suddenly, I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't curious anymore. I wasn't even concerned. I simply felt tired, comfortably tired. The figure was still there. At least I think it was. But somehow it no longer seemed important. Looking back, that part feels stranger than anything else. Why would I suddenly become calm after spending so long staring at something that terrified me? Why would my fear disappear so completely? I have no answer. All I know is that I slowly lay back down, pulled the blanket over myself, closed my eyes, and went back to sleep. Not restless sleep, not nervous sleep, normal sleep. The kind you fall into when everything feels safe. The next morning, sunlight filled the room. The events of the night came rushing back immediately. For a moment, I wondered whether I had dreamed the entire thing, but it hadn't felt like a dream, not even close. I got up and walked over to the area where the figure had been standing. I wanted answers. I wanted to find whatever object had created that silhouette. A coat rack, a chair, a stack of boxes, anything, but there was nothing. Nothing that matched the shape I remembered. Nothing tall enough. Nothing positioned correctly. Nothing that should have created the outline I had spent so much time staring at. I checked from different angles, different positions in the room, different lighting conditions. Still nothing. The more I looked, the less sense it made. If it had been a trick of the shadows, I should have been able to recreate it. If it had been furniture, I should have recognized it. But I couldn't. That doesn't mean something supernatural happened. I'm sure there are plenty of reasonable explanations. Sleep paralysis, a hypnopompic hallucination, a combination of darkness and an overactive imagination. Any of those could be true. What I know for certain is how it felt. I know I woke up suddenly. I know my cat was growling at something across the room. I know I saw a shape standing there. And I know that after staring at it for what felt like an eternity, an overwhelming sense of peace convinced me to simply lie back down and go to sleep. To this day, I don't know what I was looking at. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was something. Either way, I haven't slept in the living room since. Some mysteries are easier to leave alone than solve.